Hello everyone and welcome back to Nightmare Tales. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. The headlights carved through darkness like surgical instruments, revealing nothing but cracked asphalt and the occasional scatter of gravel kicked up by my tires. County Road 47 stretched ahead like an accusation, empty and unforgiving in the way only backwards routes can be at 3 o'clock in the morning. I'd taken this shortcut a dozen times before cutting through the pine barrens to avoid the interstate construction, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the silence pressed against my windshield with an almost physical weight. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as another mile marker flashed by its reflective surface, catching my high beams for a split second before vanishing back into the void. The radio had died 15 minutes ago, not even static to keep me company. Just the steady hum of my engine and the whisper of wind through the cracked passenger window I couldn't quite get to seal properly. That's when I saw it. A wooden sawhorse sat square in the middle of the road, about 50 yards ahead. Someone had hung what looked like a baby bottle from its crossbeam, white plastic, gleaming in my headlights like a tiny lighthouse beacon. The bottle swayed. Gently, though I couldn't feel any breeze. Through my barely open window, I eased off the gas, coasting toward the obstruction. My first thought was roadwork, but there were no orange cones, no warning signs, no equipment anywhere to be seen. Just this lone sawhorse standing guard over the empty asphalt, that bottle hanging from it like some bizarre ornament. The bottle was empty. I could see that as I rolled closer, slowing to maybe 20 miles per hour, completely empty, catching the light in a way that made it seem almost luminous. My stomach did something uncomfortable. A small twist that I told myself was just caffeine and gas station beef jerky. I pulled into the left lane to go around it. Standard procedure for road debris. Simple, logical, but as my front bumper drew level with the sawhorse, something made me glance in my rear view mirror. The sawhorse was walking, not walking. That wasn't quite right. Moving, yes, but with a mechanical precision that suggested joints and hinges rather than muscles and bone. The crossbeam had become something like a torso, and what I'd taken for the legs of the sawhorse had somehow unfolded, extended. They moved with a spider-like deliberation, each step covering an impossible amount of ground. I pressed harder on the accelerator. The speedometer climbed 40, 50, 60 miles per hour. The engine growled its approval, eager to eat up the miles between me and whatever I just witnessed. But when I checked the mirror again, the thing was still there, still maintaining the same distance from my rear bumper, maybe 20 foot back. The empty bottle bounced, with each of its strides catching my tail lights in tiny red flashes, 70 miles per hour, 80. The dotted yellow line became a continuous streak of paint beneath my wheels. Trees blurred past on either side, dark sentinels rushing towards some horizon. I couldn't see. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rhythm that seemed to match the mechanical steps I could somehow hear over the roar of wind and engine tick, 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 tick. I was doing 90 now, faster than I'd ever driven on this narrow road. But the thing behind me never fell back, never gained ground either. It just kept pace. The bottle continued its gentle swaying, hypnotic. In the red glow of my brake lights, my rational mind tried to assert itself. Trick of the light, maybe fatigue playing games with my peripheral vision? I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, hadn't I? Coming back from Sarah's funeral up in Portland, making the long drive home because I couldn't afford another night in a motel. Grief could do things to a person's perception. Stress could manifest in all sorts of ways, but when I eased off the gas to test this theory, letting my speed drop to 70, then 60, the thing slowed too. Matched my pace exactly. Those articulated legs continued their measured stride, never missing a beat. The speedometer read 100 miles per hour when I finally gave up trying to outrun it. At that speed, the world outside my windows became abstract, just suggestions of landscape painted in broad strokes of black and grey. But in my mirrors, clear as daylight, that wooden figure maintained its steady pursuit. The baby bottle hung straight down. Now, no longer swaying as if the speed had somehow stabilized it or as if whatever was carrying it had found its rhythm, I tried changing lanes again, weaving back and forth across the empty road like a drunk driver. The thing followed, every movement, staying precisely 20 foot behind my bumper. When I took a long curve to the right, it cut the corner with mathematical precision, those wooden legs never faltering. My mouth had gone dry. I reached for the water bottle in my cup holder with one trembling hand, eyes flicking constantly between the road ahead and the rear view mirror. The water tasted like copper and fear. What the hell is that thing? The question bounced around my skull like a pinball, hitting every surface of rationality I could muster and finding no satisfactory answer. Wooden sawhorses don't walk, they don't unfold like insects. They don't pursue vehicles at highway speeds while carrying baby bottles, like some twisted offering. But there it was reflected in my mirror with undeniable clarity. I tried the radio again, desperate for any sound that might anchor me to reality. Static burst from the speakers. Then, something that might have been voices distant and distorted, I cranked the volume, straining to make out words, but all I could hear were sounds that resembled crying or maybe laughing. The distinction seemed to matter less. With each passing mile, the road began to climb, winding up through a series of hills I'd forgotten about. My engine worked harder, now downshifting automatically as the grade steepened in the mirror. The wooden figure adjusted its stride without missing a step, those articulated legs eating up the incline as easily as they had the flats. I passed a sign, Milltown 15 miles to civilization, to street lights and late-night diners and people who might provide some rational explanation for what I was experiencing or, better yet, people who might not see anything at all in my rear-view mirror, confirming that exhaustion and grief had finally pushed me over some invisible edge. But what if they did see it? The thought made my hands slick with sweat against the steering wheel. What if I pulled into the parking lot of the all-night truck stop on the outskirts of Milltown and this thing followed me right under the fluorescent lights? What if other people saw those wooden legs folding and extending with mechanical precision, saw that empty bottle swaying like a pendulum marking time? What then? I crested the hill and began the long descent toward the valley where Milltown's lights should have been visible. But the valley was dark, completely dark, as if the town had simply vanished or never existed at all. My headlights swept across empty landscape, catching nothing but more trees and more roads stretching endlessly ahead. The fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank. How long have I been driving? The question struck me with sudden urgency. I'd filled up in Portland before starting the journey home, hadn't I? That was when this morning, yesterday, the timeline felt fluid, unreliable, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. I checked the clock on my dashboard 3:17 but that couldn't be right. I'd started driving at sunset, planned to be home by midnight at the latest. Unless I'd been driving in circles, unless this road didn't go where I thought it went, unless the exit signs I'd been following were leading me somewhere else, entirely. In the mirror, the wooden figure continued its relentless pursuit. The baby bottle caught my tail, lights winking red, with each step like a tiny beating heart. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was definitely audible, now penetrating the noise of wind and engine with crystalline clarity. I rolled up the passenger window, completely sealing myself in with the recycled air and my own ragged breathing, but the sound persisted. If anything, it seemed louder, more insistent. I tried to remember the last landmark I'd recognized, the last familiar sight that had convinced me. I was still on the right road, still heading toward home and sanity, and a rational explanation for all of this. But my memory felt fuzzy, unreliable. Had there been a gas station 20 miles back, a farmhouse with a porch light? Or had those been dreams, wishful hallucinations projected onto an endless stretch of unfamiliar asphalt? The speedometer still read 100 miles per hour. My fuel gauge had dropped to nearly empty, but somehow the engine kept running, kept pulling me forward through the darkness. While that thing maintained its impossible pace behind me, I began to wonder if I was still driving at all. The thought arrived with sickening clarity, like waking from a dream, only to realize you're still dreaming. What if I'd fallen asleep at the wheel hours ago? What if my car was sitting in a ditch somewhere, engine ticking as it cooled while my unconscious mind invented this endless pursuit? Or worse, What if I'd never left Portland at all? What if Sarah's funeral had been the breaking point, the moment when grief and guilt finally overwhelmed whatever defenses I'd built against the truth of what I'd done? The wooden figure in my mirror seemed to nod as if it had heard my thoughts. The baby bottle swayed once, gently, like a metronome, keeping time with my doubts. Tick, tick, tick. I eased my foot off the accelerator, letting the speedometer drop for the first time in what felt like hours. 80 miles per hour, 70, 60. The thing behind me matched my pace exactly. Never gaining, never falling back. When I brought the car to a complete stop in the middle of the road, it stopped too, standing motionless 20 foot behind my bumper like a sentry waiting for orders. I turned on my hazard lights, their rhythmic flashing, painting the interior of my car in alternating amber and shadow. In the mirror, the wooden figure was illuminated and hidden. Illuminated and hidden like something caught between dimensions. The baby bottle was no longer empty. I couldn't see what was inside. The liquid was dark, almost black in the red glow of my taillights, but it was definitely full. Now the bottle bulged slightly at the sides, as if under pressure from whatever had been poured into it. I put the car in park and turned on the dome light, flooding my interior with harsh white illumination. When I looked in the rearview mirror, now I could see my own face reflected back at me, hollow-eyed, stubbled, wearing an expression I didn't recognize. Behind my reflection, visible through the rear window, was nothing but empty road and darkness. The wooden figure was gone. I twisted in my seat, looking directly through the rear window instead of relying on the mirror. The road behind me stretched away into blackness, empty of everything except the fading echo of my hazard. Lights. No say worse, no articulated legs, no baby bottle filled with dark liquid, nothing at all. I turned off the dome light and checked the mirrors again. Still nothing, just my own eyes staring back at me wide with confusion and something that might have been relief. The radio crackled to life without warning, filling the car with the sound of a woman's voice reported missing after failing to return home from static. Swallowed the rest of the sentence, but I caught fragments. Vehicle located approximately and search efforts continue. Before the signal dissolved completely, I turned the radio off with shaking fingers. The fuel gauge showed completely empty, now the needle resting below the red line. But the engine continued to idle smoothly, as if running on something other than gasoline. I put the car back in drive and pressed gently on the accelerator. We began to move forward again, my headlights revealing the same endless stretch of asphalt I'd been following for how long now? The speedometer climbed back to 100 miles per hour without any conscious effort on my part, as if the car knew where it needed to go and how fast it needed to get there. In the rear-view mirror, 20 foot behind my bumper, the wooden figure resumed its mechanical stride. The baby bottle hung from its cross-beam full, once again swaying gently with each impossible step. Tick, 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 tick. I no longer tried to outrun it. I no longer looked for exits or landmarks or signs of civilization. I simply drove following the road wherever it led. While behind me, that relentless figure kept perfect pace with my flight. The bottle continued to sway its dark contents, sloshing gently against the plastic walls. And though I couldn't bring myself to look directly at it for more than a few seconds at a time, I was beginning to suspect I knew exactly what it contained. After all, some hungers follow you no matter how fast you run. Some debts can only be paid with time and distance, and the endless repetition of flight. And some roads, once taken, lead nowhere except back to the place where you first learned what it means to be truly irredeemably lost. Story 2, the headlamp's beam, carved through darkness that seemed to push back, thick as tar and twice as oppressive. I'd been underground for 3 hours mapping the abandoned copper mines' lower tunnels for the geological survey, but something felt wrong the moment I descended past the 40-foot mark. The air tasted metallic, not from ore deposits, but something else, something organic and stale like breath. Held too long, my breathing echoed strangely, in the narrow passage, the sound bouncing off walls that pressed closer with each step. The tunnel system wasn't on any of the original mine blueprints. A discovery that should have excited me professionally, but instead sent cold fingers walking up my spine. Whoever had carved these passages had done so recently. The tool marks still sharp against the clay-rich earth. The temperature dropped noticeably as I moved deeper, my breath forming pale clouds that dissipated too quickly in the heavy air. Something about the way sound traveled here felt wrong. Conversations seemed to carry from impossible distances, though I was alone down here. At least I was supposed to be alone. That's when I first heard it, a wet, rhythmic sound like someone working clay with their hands. The noise would start whenever I stopped moving, as if triggered by my stillness. When I called out, my voice returned from the depths ahead, distorted and somehow mocking. The echo lasted longer than physics should allow. In such confined spaces, I pressed forward, driven by professional curiosity that was rapidly transforming into something more urgent, a need to understand what lay ahead before something understood me. First, the tunnel began to widen, opening into a chamber I hadn't expected. My headlamp swept across rough-hewn walls decorated with symbols I didn't recognize, carved deep into the clay surface. They resembled tribal markings, but their arrangement followed no pattern I could identify. Some appeared fresh, still marked with tool shavings, while others looked ancient, worn smooth by countless touching hands. The air grew thicker, here almost viscous, carrying a scent that reminded me of pottery studios and something else, something primal and disturbing. It coated my throat, making each breath feel substantial, like drinking dust. I pulled out my phone to document the chamber, but the screen flickered strangely, casting shadows that moved independently of my movements. That's when I saw it. In the center of the chamber stood a figure, perfectly motionless, carved from the same clay, rich earth, that formed the walls. But this wasn't some ancient artifact or primitive sculpture. This was me, every detail perfect, from the way my hair fell across my forehead to the exact positioning of the scar on my left knuckle. Even my clothes were replicated with impossible precision, down to the coffee stain on my field jacket from that morning. The clay version of myself stood with arms at its sides, head tilted slightly to the left, the exact pose I'd been in when examining the wall symbols moments before. But I was standing to the right now, having moved several feet since then. How could it have captured a position I'd occupied seconds earlier? My hands trembled as I directed the headlamp's beam across the figure's surface. The light revealed intricate tribal symbols covering every inch of the clay skin, similar to those carved into the walls, but somehow more complex, more alive. They seemed to pulse gently in the illumination, as if the clay retained some residual warmth. The figure's eyes were closed, but its chest rose and fell with steady, hypnotic breathing, not the breathing of lungs, but something else, the compression and expansion of earth itself, as if the chamber's atmosphere was being processed through clay organs. With each breath, a fine red dust escaped from between its lips, hanging in the air like suspended blood. I took a step closer, fascinated, despite every instinct screaming at me to run. The craftsmanship was impossible. No human hand could achieve such detail, especially not in this crude environment. Yet here it stood, a perfect mirror of myself, rendered in earth and mystery. The red dust began to thicken, forming small clouds that drifted toward me with deliberate purpose. As the particles reached my nostrils, I felt my throat constrict, not from allergic reaction or physical obstruction, but something far worse. My voice simply vanished, as if the dust was absorbing my ability to make sound. I tried to speak, to call out, but nothing emerged except a thin wheeze. Panic set in as I realized the air itself was changing, becoming heavier, more substantial. Each breath felt like swallowing sand, and I could taste clay coating my tongue, filling my mouth with the flavor of deep earth and ancient things. The clay figure's breathing intensified, its chest rising higher with each inhalation. More red dust poured from its mouth, now creating a small maelstrom in the chamber center. The tribal symbols on its skin began to glow faintly, not with light, but with some inner darkness that made them visible against the clay surface. I stumbled backward, my headlamp beam, dancing wildly across the walls. As my coordination failed, the symbols carved into the chamber walls were moving now, shifting and rearranging themselves like living text, rewriting itself in real time. They spelled out warnings in languages I couldn't read but somehow understood. Leave, run, never return. But my feet wouldn't obey. The clay dust had settled into my lungs, each breath bringing more earth inside me, transforming my airways into something solid and foreign. I could feel my chest growing heavier. My heartbeat muffled as if wrapped in thick fabric. The air wasn't just becoming clay. I was becoming clay. Molecule by molecule, breath by breath, the figure opened its eyes. They were my eyes, but filled with the deep darkness of underground spaces where no light had ever penetrated. They tracked my movements with liquid precision, following my desperate attempts to retreat. When our gazes met, I saw myself reflected infinitely in those earthen pupils, a recursive nightmare of identity folding in on itself. The clay version of me smiled, and dust cascaded from between its teeth like sand from an hourglass. It raised one hand, and I watched my own fingers, the real ones, begin to move in perfect synchronization. I was no longer controlling my body. It was controlling me. Or we were controlling each other, or there was no difference anymore. Fighting against the paralysis creeping up from my clay-filled lungs, I forced myself to turn and run. My feet felt heavy, each step requiring enormous effort, as if I was wading through thick mud behind me. I could hear the sound of clay feet following, matching my pace exactly, not pursuing but accompanying, like a shadow given substance. The tunnel seemed longer on the way out, stretching impossibly, as I struggled toward the surface. My breathing came in short, panicked gasps, each one bringing more earth into my system. I could taste minerals and ancient water, the flavor of things long buried and forgotten. My throat was completely sealed. Now, voice gone forever, replaced by the hollow whistle of wind through clay pipes. The tribal symbols on the walls followed my progress, rearranging themselves to spell out new messages. As I passed, "You cannot leave what you have become. The clay remembers you are home now." I reached the main shaft and began climbing, my hands slipping on rungs that felt softer than metal, more yielding, like clay shaped to resemble ladder rungs. Each one left red dust on my palms, and I realized with growing horror that I was leaving handprints, my handprints, in the clay-coated metal, as if I had been down here before, marking my passage many times. Daylight felt like a physical assault when I finally emerged from the mine entrance. The sun seemed too bright, too harsh. After the gentle darkness below, I gasped in real air, trying to flush the clay from my lungs, but the taste remained, coating everything with the flavor of deep earth. I drove home in silence, unable to speak, unable to call anyone for help. My throat felt permanently altered, as if the clay had taken root there, transforming flesh into something more malleable, more responsive to underground pressures and ancient rhythms. That night I dreamed of working clay with my hands, shaping figures in perfect darkness, while tribal symbols wrote themselves across my skin. In the dream, I understood that the chamber hadn't been carved by human tools at all, but by countless hands like mine, working in the darkness, creating perfect copies of themselves to leave behind. When they finally emerged, changed, I woke to find red dust on my pillow and clay under my fingernails, though I couldn't remember touching either. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked wrong, not dramatically different but subtly altered, as if my features had been reshaped by careful invisible hands during the night. 3 days have passed since my encounter in the mine, and I still cannot speak. Medical tests show nothing wrong with my throat, my lungs, my vocal cords. The doctor suggests psychological trauma, stress-induced muteness, but I know better. The clay is still there, waiting, transforming me from the inside out. I keep finding myself standing in poses I don't remember, taking positions that feel familiar yet foreign, as if my body is practicing for some future performance. Sometimes I catch myself holding perfectly still for minutes at a time, barely breathing, feeling the weight of earth in my chest and the memory of tribal symbols burning behind my closed eyelids. The strangest part is how natural it feels, the silence, the stillness, the gradual sensation of becoming something other than entirely human. Part of me wants to return to the chamber to see if my clay double is still there, still breathing dust and wearing my face. Part of me suspects I never really left at all, because sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet, I can hear the sound of wet clay being worked by invisible hands. And I know with certainty that terrifies and comforts me in equal measure that somewhere deep underground, in a chamber decorated with living symbols, my other self is still standing in perfect stillness, breathing red dust and waiting for me to remember who I really am. The tribal markings on my skin are starting to show story 3. The cattle shouldn't have been standing like that. I noticed it first when I approached the gate to secure the evening latch. 23, head of Black Angus, arranged in a perfect circle, motionless as cemetery stones, no shifting weight from hoof to hoof, no lazy tail swishes, no mindless chewing, just silence, stretching across the pasture like a held breath. The blue lights appeared as I reached for the gate handle. They materialized without fanfare, 6 orbs of electric sapphire hovering 15 feet above the grass, casting cold radiance over my herd. The light didn't behave like any illumination I'd known in 40 years of ranch work. It seemed to sink into the animals rather than reflect off their hides, turning their black coats into something that absorbed rather than merely darkened. I stood frozen, my hand suspended inches from the rusted metal latch. The lights pulsed in unison, a rhythm that felt almost biological, like watching someone's chest rise and fall during deep sleep. With each pulse, the cattle swayed slightly, as if responding to music only they could hear. That's when the singing began. It drifted down from the oak grove beyond the pasture, a sound that made my teeth ache. Metallic voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate in my bones. The melody, if it could be called that, consisted of notes that bent and twisted, never quite resolving into anything my mind could categorize as music. It reminded me of wind chimes made from surgical steel, each tone sharp enough to cut. I took a step backward and the blue light shifted with me. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. As my boot scraped against the gravel, all 6 orbs drifted backward by exactly the same distance. When I tilted my head to get a better view, they tilted in perfect synchronization. The realization hit me like ice water in my veins. They were mirroring my every motion with mechanical precision. Looking down, I discovered the grass beneath my feet had changed. Spiral patterns, delicate as frost, were emerging in the dried August lawn. They sprouted outward from where I stood, intricate whorls that seemed to grow as I watched. The designs reminded me of the shell patterns I'd collected as a boy on Galveston beaches. But these were wrong, somehow too complex, too purposeful. They pulsed with the same rhythm as the floating lights, appearing and disappearing like thoughts made visible. I tried to convince myself I was hallucinating. The heat had been brutal all week, reaching 104 degrees by afternoon. Maybe I was dehydrated. Maybe the stress of the drought had finally pushed my mind past its breaking point. But the singing continued and the lights kept their patient mimicry, and deep in my gut, I knew this was happening, whether my brain could accept it or not. The cattle remained motionless. Heads turned toward the center of their circle, where nothing stood but empty grass. Their eyes reflected the blue radiance like dark mirrors, and I realized they weren't blinking. Not one of them. 23 pairs of unblinking eyes staring at nothing while metal voices sang them deeper into whatever trance held them. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, thinking to call my neighbor, Jake, or maybe even the sheriff, but the screen showed no signal, not just weak reception, complete absence, as if the device had forgotten how to be a phone. The time display flickered between 9:47 p.m. and symbols. I didn't recognize angular marks that hurt to look at directly. A new sound joined the chorus from the trees. Footsteps, but not quite right. The rhythm was off, like someone walking with too many legs or not enough. They circled the grove in measured intervals, never coming closer but never fading either. Occasionally I caught glimpses of movement between the oak trunks, shapes that might have been human if humans moved like liquid shadow. I found myself studying the spiral patterns more intently, noticing how they seemed to contain meaning just beyond my understanding. Mathematical relationships revealed themselves in the curves, formulas written in a script my education had never encountered. The longer I stared, the more sense they began to make, as if some part of my brain was learning to read a language it had always known but forgotten. That terrified me more than anything else. I forced myself to look away and focus on practical matters. The gate still needed latching. The horses in the far paddock required checking, normal tasks that might anchor me to normal reality. But when I tried to step toward the gate, my legs wouldn't cooperate. Not paralyzed, I could feel muscle and bone responding to my commands, but moving through something thicker than air, as if the space around me had gained the consistency of honey. The blue lights pulsed brighter and the cattle began to turn slowly. With the mechanical precision of clockwork, All 23 animals rotated to face me. Their eyes held no recognition, no trace of the mild curiosity that usually marked their attention. These were the vacant stares of sleepwalkers, windows into rooms where no one was home. In the growing intensity of that strange illumination, I noticed other changes. The fence posts cast shadows in directions that defied the position of the lights. My own reflection appeared in the metal gate, but it moved a half-second behind my actual movements, like a poorly synchronized movie. When I raised my hand to wipe sweat from my forehead, my reflection did the same a moment later, wearing an expression I wasn't making. The singing from the trees grew more complex, adding layers I hadn't noticed before. Underneath the metallic harmonies, I detected what sounded like human voices, not words exactly, but the rhythmic cadence of speech in a language that predated syllables. The sound seemed familiar, like half-remembered lullabies from childhood, though I was certain I'd never heard anything like them before I started walking backward toward the house, testing my theory about the lights. Sure enough, they maintained their positions relative to my location, creating the illusion that I was the center of some vast celestial mechanism. With each step, the spiral patterns in the grass grew more elaborate, extending outward like ripples in a geometric pond. The kitchen light beckoned from across the yard, warm yellow against the impossible blue. I needed to reach that normal space to prove to myself that reality still existed beyond this circle of wrongness. But the further I retreated, the more the landscape seemed to stretch, as if distance itself was becoming elastic. The house appeared simultaneously closer and farther away, like looking at it through a funhouse mirror. Halfway across the yard, I realized I could no longer hear my own footsteps. The gravel crunched under my boots. I could feel the sensation traveling up through my legs, but no sound reached my ears. Instead, the metallic singing had grown so pervasive it seemed to emerge from inside my skull. The voices were teaching me their song, note by impossible note, and I found myself humming along without consciously deciding to do so. I stopped humming immediately, biting my tongue hard enough to taste blood. The physical pain felt, reassuring proof that some things still operated according to familiar rules. But when I touched my tongue to check for damage, my fingers came away clean, despite the metallic taste flooding my mouth. The blue lights had begun to descend. They lowered themselves toward the cattle with the patient deliberation of settling birds. As they drew closer, the animals' forms became less distinct edges, blurring as if viewed through heat shimmer. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but the effect persisted. My herd was becoming translucent, their substance seeming to flow upward into the approaching radiance. I ran then, abandoning any pretense of rational behavior. My legs pumped against the elastic air, while the house refused to grow larger. In my vision behind me, the singing reached a crescendo that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. The sound wasn't just audible anymore, it was tactile, pressing against my skin like invisible hands. The kitchen door handle felt like salvation under my palm. I stumbled inside and slammed the door, twisting both locks and drawing the curtains over the window in the familiar yellow light surrounded by coffee mugs and unpaid bills. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined everything. But through the thin fabric of the curtains, blue light still filtered into my kitchen, and when I pressed my ear to the door I could hear the singing continuing, not from the trees now, but from directly outside, as if the source had followed me across the yard. I spent the night huddled at my kitchen table, watching shadows move past the windows, shapes that might have been human if humans cast no reflection in glass and moved with perfect silence. When dawn finally broke, I found the courage to look outside. The pasture was empty. No cattle, no evidence they'd ever been there. The grass showed no spiral patterns, nowhere marks from 23 animals standing in formation. Even the fence posts looked freshly painted, though I hadn't touched them in years. I called Jake to ask if he'd seen my herd, but he insisted I'd sold the cattle 3 months ago after the bank foreclosure notice. He had the paperwork to prove it. Documents I didn't remember signing, but that bore my signature nonetheless. The realtor confirmed I'd been living in town since spring, renting the small apartment above the hardware store. But I remember the ranch. I remember 40 years of dawn feeding and evening chores. I remember the weight of hay bales and the smell of leather tack and the specific creak of the barn door that never got oiled properly. Most of all, I remember the blue lights and the singing that taught me melodies. I still hum without thinking. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment, I catch glimpses of electric sapphire reflecting in my bathroom mirror. When I turn to look directly, there's nothing there, just my own face wearing an expression I don't remember making. And if I listen carefully to the silence, I can still hear metal voices calling from distances too far to measure, singing songs that make perfect sense in a language I was never taught but somehow always knew. The spiral patterns appear in my coffee, sometimes delicate whirls that form and dissolve before I can fully focus on them. I've learned not to stare too long. Understanding comes whether you invite it or not, and some knowledge changes you in ways that can't be undone. I keep telling myself it was hallucination brought on by stress and heat and the slow dissolution of everything I thought I knew about my life. The alternative, that I've glimpsed something vast and patient and utterly indifferent to human categories of real and unreal, is too large for my mind to accommodate. But late at night, when the apartment walls seem thinner than paper and the darkness beyond my windows pulses with remembered rhythms, I find myself humming along to melodies that exist in frequencies just below hearing. And I wonder if the lights are still out there, hovering over empty pastures waiting for the next person who needs to learn their song. The cattle were never the point. I think they were just the invitation. The real question isn't whether it happened. The real question is whether it's still happening in ways too subtle for conscious perception but loud enough for dreams, and whether the part of me that learned to read those spiral patterns is growing stronger each night, preparing for the moment when I'll understand completely what the metal voices have been trying to teach me. I hope that moment never comes, but I suspect hope has very little to do with it. Story 4. The retreat house smelled like centuries of whispered prayers and floor wax, a combination that should have been comforting but instead settled in my lungs like dust from a tomb. I'd come here seeking clarity or perhaps escape from the noise that had been building in my head for months, the kind of noise that makes you question whether the thoughts rattling around in your skull are entirely your own. Brother Francis had assigned me to the dormitory on the 3rd floor, a long room lined with iron bunk beds that creaked with every movement, 24 beds in total, though only half were occupied during this particular retreat. The other men, mostly middle-aged like myself, had introduced themselves with the careful politeness of people carrying invisible wounds. We were all here for reasons we couldn't quite articulate. Drawn by the promise of silence and contemplation, the first night passed without incident. I slept poorly, the mattress was thin and the springs sang with every turn. But that was expected. What I hadn't expected was to wake at 3:17 in the morning with the absolute certainty that someone was watching me. The room was bathed in that peculiar darkness that exists only in old buildings, where shadows seemed to have weight and substance. The windows were tall and narrow, letting in just enough moonlight to create pools of silver on the polished wooden floor. I lay perfectly still in my bottom bunk, listening to the familiar symphony of sleeping men, snores shifting blankets, the occasional muttered word from a dream. But there was something else, a sound that didn't belong. Click, 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 rhythmic, deliberate, like wooden beads being rolled between fingers. It came from somewhere to my left, where the bunk beds were arranged, in a neat row against the wall. I turned my head slowly, every muscle in my neck protesting the movement. That's when I saw him. He sat on the stairs of the bunk bed, directly across from mine, perched on the 3rd step up. His posture was wrong in a way that made my teeth ache, spine twisted at an angle that human vertebrae shouldn't accommodate, head cocked like a bird studying prey. But where his face should have been, there was only smooth skin, unmarked and pale as candle wax. In his hands he held a rosary. The beads were dark, possibly ebony, and each time he rolled one between his fingers it produced that soft, clicking sound, wood against wood, like dry bones knocking together in a winter wind. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the sleeping dormitory, yet none of the other men stirred. I wanted to close my eyes, to sink back into sleep and let this vision dissolve like the nightmare it surely was. But the faceless man began to turn. His entire torso rotated, shoulders following an axis that defied anatomy, until he was facing me completely, while his legs remained pointed toward the stairs. The movement was fluid, serpentine, and accompanied by the faint sound of joints that shouldn't exist. Finding new configurations, he held up the rosary, displaying it like an offering or a threat. In the weak moonlight, I could see that several beads were missing from the string, leaving gaps like missing teeth in a skull's grin as I watched. Frozen by a terror that felt both primitive and absolute, another bead slipped from the strand. It fell to the floor with a sound like a pebble dropping into still water. But when it hit the polished wood, it didn't bounce or roll. Instead it scattered into fragments, pale curved pieces that looked disturbingly like bone chips. The faceless man's head tilted further, as if inviting me to come closer and examine his handiwork. I must have made a sound, a gasp or whimper, because suddenly he was still completely motionless, except for his fingers, which continued their methodical manipulation of the remaining beads. One by one, they fell, each transforming upon impact with the floor into those same bone-white fragments. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through 43 years of life without losing complete touch with reality, began cataloguing explanations. Stress, insomnia, the unfamiliar environment, perhaps some kind of medication interaction, though I'd taken nothing stronger than aspirin in months. Hypnagogic hallucinations were common during the transition between sleep and wakefulness, but my body knew better. Every cell screamed that this was real, that the faceless man sitting impossibly twisted on those wooden stairs was as solid and present as the mattress beneath me or the walls around us. The smell in the air had changed too, still that underlying scent of wax and prayer, but now tinged with something else, something organic and old. I forced myself to look away to scan the room for any sign that the other men had noticed the intrusion. Brother Martinez snored peacefully in the bed closest to the door. Mr. Patterson, an accountant from Milwaukee who'd spoken during evening prayer about losing his way after his divorce, lay curled on his side like a child. Everyone slept undisturbed, cocooned in their private darkness. When I looked back, the stairs were empty. The bone fragments remained. Dawn couldn't come quickly enough. I lay rigid until the first bell rang at 6, then rose and dressed with mechanical precision. The other men stirred and began their morning routines, none of them glancing toward the spot where I'd seen the impossible visitor. I waited until the dormitory had mostly emptied before approaching the bunk bed in question. The stairs were old but well maintained, each step worn smooth by decades of climbing feet. I knelt and examined the floor beneath them, running my fingers over the polished wood. Nothing, no bone fragments, no evidence of any disturbance. The surface was immaculate, reflecting the morning light that streamed through the tall windows. I told myself this was proof of the hallucination theory. Stress, insomnia, unfamiliar surroundings, all perfectly logical explanations for a perfectly explainable phenomenon. The mind, after all, was notorious for playing tricks, especially when pushed beyond its comfort zone. But as I stood to leave, something caught my eye. There, wedged between two floorboards near the base of the bunk bed, was a single dark bead. I plucked it free and held it up to the light. It was carved from some kind of dense wood, polished smooth by countless fingers, ebony perhaps, or something similar, the kind of bead you might find on an old rosary, the type passed down through generations of faithful hands. Brother Francis found me in the chapel an hour later, still clutching the bead. I'd been sitting in the back pew, staring at the simple wooden cross that dominated the front wall, trying to reconcile what I'd seen with what I knew to be possible trouble sleeping, he asked. Settling beside me with the careful movements of a man whose knees had seen better days, I wanted to tell him everything about the faceless man, the impossible contortions, the rosary that shed beads like tears. Instead, I held up the small piece of carved wood. I found this in the dormitory, I said, thought someone might have lost it. Brother Francis took the bead and examined it with the same careful attention I'd given it. His expression was unreadable, but I caught something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or concern. Old rosaries sometimes fall apart, he said. Finally, the string weakens over time. We find loose beads around the retreat house fairly regularly. Have you ever? I paused, unsure how to frame the question without sounding completely unhinged. Have you ever had anyone report unusual experiences here? Things they couldn't explain? The elderly priest was quiet for a long moment, his fingers working the bead between his thumb and forefinger, in a motion that reminded me uncomfortably of the night's events. This is a place where people come to confront their inner darkness, he said. Eventually, sometimes that darkness takes forms we don't expect. The important thing is not to give it more power than it deserves. He handed the bead back to me. Keep it, if you like. Consider it a reminder that not everything we see is what it appears to be. The second night was worse. I'd spent the day in prayer and meditation following the retreat schedule with desperate determination. Morning prayer, silent breakfast, lectio divina, afternoon reflection, evening vespers. Each ritual felt like armor against whatever had visited me the night before. A carefully constructed barrier between the rational world and whatever lurked beyond its borders. But as darkness fell and the dormitory settled into its nightly rhythm, that familiar dread began to build in my chest. I lay in my bunk, eyes closed, pretending to sleep, while every nerve in my body remained on high alert. The clicking started at 2:43. This time I didn't hesitate to look. The faceless man sat in the same position on the stairs. His body twisted in that impossible configuration. But now I could see more details. His clothes were simple dark pants and a white shirt that might have belonged to any of the retreat participants. His hands were pale but well-formed, moving with practiced precision as they worked the rosary beads, and there were fewer beads than before. As I watched, he held up the rosary so I could see the growing gaps in the string. Nearly half the beads were missing, now leaving long stretches of bare cord. Each remaining bead seemed to pulse with its own dark light, as if illuminated from within by some source I couldn't identify. The faceless man's head turned toward me and, though he had no features, I felt the weight of his attention like a physical force. He raised one hand and beckoned, the gesture unmistakably clear. Despite his lack of expression, the invitation was as obvious as it was terrifying. Come closer, come see what I have to show you. I found myself sitting up in bed, my legs swinging over the edge of the mattress, before I consciously decided to move. The compulsion was overwhelming, like being pulled by invisible strings. The faceless man's beckoning gesture became more insistent, his impossible posture somehow conveying eagerness. 3 steps across the dormitory floor, 4, 5. The other sleeping men might as well have been corpses, for all the awareness they showed. Their breathing continued in steady rhythm, undisturbed by the wrongness that filled the air like smoke. I walked forward in a dream state, each step bringing me closer to the figure on the stairs. That's when I noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, woven so seamlessly into the familiar sense of wax and old wood that I almost missed it. But with each step it grew stronger. Decay, not the sharp reek of fresh death, but something older and more patient, the smell of things that had been buried too long, of earth that had given up its secrets. Reluctantly, the faceless man dropped another bead. This one landed directly at my feet and exploded into fragments with a sound like breaking pottery. The pieces were larger, now clearly recognizable as bone, finger bones perhaps, or pieces of a wrist. They gleamed white in the moonlight, polished to an unnatural sheen. I stopped walking. The rational part of my mind, which had been growing quieter each day of the retreat, suddenly reasserted itself with the force of a slap. What was I doing? Walking toward a hallucinatory figure in the middle of the night, following the gestures of something that couldn't possibly exist. The stress of the past months had clearly taken a greater toll than I'd realized. I turned and walked back to my bed, each step a conscious act of will. Against the pull I still felt from the stairs behind me, the clicking sound stopped abruptly, replaced by something that might have been a sigh, or perhaps the sound of old wood settling in the night air. I lay down and pulled the thin blanket over my head, creating a barrier that felt pathetically inadequate, but was all I had. Under the cotton shield, I pressed my palms against my eyes and tried to convince myself that when I looked again, the stairs would be empty. I was wrong. When I finally emerged from my makeshift tent, the faceless man was standing at the foot of my bed. He was taller than I'd realized. His frame lean but somehow substantial. The impossible twist of his torso had straightened, though his head still cocked at that unnatural angle. In his hands he held the remains of the rosary, just a few beads now strung on a length of cord that looked more like sinew than string. He extended the rosary toward me, offering it with the same gesture he'd used to beckon me. Closer up close, I could see that the remaining beads weren't carved from wood at all. They were bone, each one a perfect sphere polished to gleaming whiteness, and they were warm. Even from several feet away, I could feel the heat radiating from them like small suns. The faceless man's chest rose and fell in a parody of breathing where his mouth should have been. The skin moved slightly, as if he were trying to speak words that his lack of features made impossible. I wanted to scream, I wanted to wake the other men, to shatter the terrible privacy of this encounter and drag it into the harsh light of shared reality. But my voice had deserted me, leaving only a raw ache in my throat, where words should have been. Instead, I found myself reaching out. The movement was involuntary, my hands stretching toward the offered rosary, despite every instinct screaming against it. The faceless man leaned forward, his featureless face somehow conveying anticipation. The remaining beads on the string pulsed brighter, their internal light casting moving shadows on the dormitory walls. My fingertips were inches from the first bead when Brother Francis's voice cut through the darkness. "Matthew, are you all right?" I spun around my heart, hammering against my ribs. The elderly priest stood in the doorway, backlit by the corridor's emergency lighting. He was fully dressed. Despite the late hour, his face creased with concern. "I heard walking," he said, stepping into the room. Sometimes the new retreatants have trouble adjusting to the quiet. I looked back toward my bed. The stairs were empty. The faceless man was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of something old and patient and wrong. I couldn't sleep. I managed my voice cracking like a teenager's. Brother Francis nodded knowingly. He'd seen this before. His expression suggested men who came to the retreat house carrying burdens too heavy for normal life, who found that the silence and solitude sometimes made those burdens echo louder rather than fade away. "Walk with me," he said gently. "Sometimes a change of scenery helps." I followed him from the dormitory, grateful for his steady presence and the normalcy of his voice. But as we reached the doorway, I glanced back one final time. On the floor beneath the bunk bed stairs, bone fragments gleamed in the moonlight like scattered teeth. Brother Francis led me to his small office on the second floor, a cramped space lined with books and smelling strongly of pipe tobacco. He gestured for me to take the single chair while he settled behind his desk, moving with the careful precision of someone accustomed to functioning on little sleep. "This isn't the first time, is it?" he asked. Without preamble, I stared at him, unsure how to respond. How much could I say without crossing the line into complete madness? How could I explain that I'd been visited twice now by something that shouldn't exist, that had offered me a rosary made of human bone, the bead you showed me yesterday? Brother Francis continued when I didn't answer. "You didn't find it on the floor, did you?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so careful to present the discovery as mundane, just another piece of debris in an old building. But somehow he'd seen through the deception. "Tell me what you've seen," he said, and his voice carried an authority that made lies impossible. So I told him everything: the faceless man on the stairs, the impossible contortions, the rosary that shed beads like tears, the bone fragments that appeared and disappeared, the compulsion to move closer the way the other men slept through encounters that should have woken the dead. Brother Francis listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. His fingers steepled beneath his chin. "How long have you been having trouble sleeping?" he asked. "Finally, months since," I paused, realizing I'd never articulated the connection before. Since my wife left, she said I'd changed, become someone she didn't recognize, said I was obsessed with things that weren't real. What kind of things? The office seemed to grow smaller around us, the walls pressing closer as I struggled to find words for experiences I'd barely acknowledged to myself. Sounds in the walls of our house, voices when no one was there, the feeling that someone was watching me even when I was alone. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. She was right. Of course I was losing my mind, still am. Apparently Brother Francis reached into his desk drawer and pulled out something that made my blood freeze. A rosary, but not just any rosary. This one was missing nearly half its beads, leaving gaps in the string like missing teeth. "This was found in the dormitory 3 months ago," he said, setting it on the desk between us. The man who left it behind had been experiencing similar difficulties. I stared at the broken rosary, my mouth suddenly dry as dust. The remaining beads were dark, wood, possibly ebony, carved with the same precision as the one I'd found beneath the stairs. "Where is he now?" "Safe," Brother Francis said. but something in his voice suggested the definition of safety might be more complex than I'd assumed. He chose to stay with us permanently. Sometimes that's the only way to find peace. The implication hung in the air like incense smoke. I thought of the men I'd seen around the retreat house during the day, not just the temporary visitors like myself, but the permanent residents who helped with maintenance and kitchen duties. Men with haunted eyes who spoke little and moved with the careful precision of people constantly listening for sounds that others couldn't hear. "What exactly is this place?" I asked. Brother Francis smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "A refuge for men who've seen too much, who carry burdens that the outside world can't understand. We offer silence, solitude, and safety from the things that hunt in the spaces between waking and sleeping. And if I leave, then you leave. But the things you've seen don't stay behind. They follow, growing stronger with each encounter. Until," he gestured toward the broken rosary, "until there's nothing left but fragments." I thought of my empty apartment, the divorce papers still sitting unsigned on my kitchen table, the job I'd taken leave from and might never return to. What was waiting for me in the outside world except more sleepless nights and the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with the reality I'd always taken for granted. "The faceless man," I said. "What is he?" "A manifestation, a reflection of the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. He appears to men who've lost touch with their own identity, who've spent so long pretending to be someone else that they've forgotten who they really are." The words hit uncomfortably. Close to home, I thought of the years I'd spent in a marriage that felt like performance art, playing the role of the dependable husband, while something essential inside me withered and died. The career that had consumed decades of my life without ever bringing satisfaction. The careful construction of a normal life that had collapsed the moment I admitted I couldn't recognize myself in the mirror. "What does he want to complete?" "The exchange. Each bead represents a part of your authentic self, the pieces you've surrendered in the name of fitting in. When the last bead falls," Brother Francis shrugged, "some transformations are irreversible." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the bead I'd been carrying since the morning before. In the office's warm light, it looked ordinary, just a piece of carved wood worn smooth by handling. "How many beads are usually on a rosary?" 59, typically 50. Hail Marys. 6 Our Fathers and 3 for the opening prayers. I looked at the broken strand on his desk, counting the gaps. At least 30 beads were missing, leaving fewer than 30 remaining if the pattern held if the faceless man continued his nightly visits. I had, perhaps a week before the string was empty, a week to decide whether to flee back to a world that felt increasingly unreal or to join the hollow-eyed men who'd found their own form of peace in the retreat house's permanent embrace. Brother Francis seemed to read my thoughts. "There is a third option," he said quietly, "but it requires courage most men don't possess, which is to face him, to reclaim what you've lost instead of surrendering what remains." The third night I was ready. I'd spent the day in preparation, not through prayer or meditation, but through a different kind of focus. I thought about the man I'd been before the slow erosion began. The person who'd once had dreams beyond mere survival, who'd felt passion and purpose instead of just the grinding momentum of routine. That man had been buried so gradually I'd barely noticed his disappearance. Years of compromise, of choosing safety over authenticity, of saying yes when I meant no and smiling when I wanted to scream. The faceless man wasn't a supernatural visitor. He was me, the part of myself I'd abandoned in the name of respectability. When the clicking started at 3:07, I was already sitting up in bed. The faceless man occupied his usual position on the stairs. His body twisted in that impossible configuration. But tonight something was different. The rosary in his hands was nearly bare. Only 5 or 6 beads remained on the string, glowing with that internal light like captured stars. He looked up at my movement, his featureless face somehow conveying satisfaction. The game was almost over. Soon the last bead would fall and whatever transformation he represented would be complete. I stood up, but instead of walking toward him, I walked to the center of the dormitory and spoke, not loudly. The other men continued sleeping, their breathing undisturbed but with a clarity that cut through the oppressive atmosphere like a blade. "I know who you are." The faceless man's head tilted, his impossible posture shifting slightly. The clicking of the rosary beads stopped. "You're Every compromise I made, every time I chose comfort over truth, safety over growth. Every moment I pretended to be someone else because being myself felt too dangerous. I took another step forward, no longer compelled but choosing to move closer. You want me to give up the rest, to hand over whatever pieces of my real self are left and disappear completely into the comfortable numbness of not being the faceless man held up the rosary, offering it as he had before. But now I could see the gesture for what it really was, not a gift but a surrender. He wanted me to take the remaining beads to complete the process of self-erasure that had been ongoing for decades. No, I said simply. The word hung in the air like a prayer. The faceless man's posture straightened his impossible twist, beginning to unwind for the first time. His movements looked painful rather than fluid, as if the contortion that had defined him was becoming difficult to maintain. I reached out, but not toward the rosary. Instead, I placed my hand on his featureless face. The skin was warm and smooth, neither alive nor dead, but something in between. Under my touch I felt something shift, a tremor that ran through his entire frame, like a building settling on its foundation. "You don't get to have them," I whispered. "The parts of me I gave away, I'm taking them back." The faceless man began to change. Features appeared under my palm, not carved or drawn, but emerging like photographs developing in a dark room. An eye familiar and tired, a mouth that had forgotten how to speak its own truth. The bridge of a nose I recognized from bathroom mirrors and family photos. My own face wearing an expression of desperate hope. The rosary in his hands transformed as well. The few remaining beads grew brighter, their bone-white surface warming to something that looked almost alive. And as I watched, new beads began to appear on the string. Not bone this time, but something richer and more complex. Experiences I'd denied myself. Dreams I'd abandoned, words I'd swallowed instead of speaking aloud. When the transformation was complete, I was looking at myself, not the careful performance I'd maintained for decades, but the authentic self I'd buried so deep I'd forgotten he existed. He was thinner than I remembered, worn down by years of suppression, but his eyes held a light I hadn't seen in my own reflection for longer than I cared to calculate. He held out the completed rosary, 59 beads, now glowing with warm living light. "These are yours," he said, and his voice was mine, but somehow more real than any sound I'd made in years. They always were. I took the rosary, feeling the weight of each bead like a recovered memory. The moment my fingers closed around the string, my reflection smiled, not the practiced expression I used in public, but something genuine and unguarded. Then he was gone, not vanishing but somehow integrating, becoming part of me in a way that felt like remembering how to breathe. I stood alone in the dormitory, holding a rosary that felt warm and substantial in my hands around me. The other men slept peacefully, their breathing undisturbed by the quiet revolution that had just taken place. When morning came, I packed my few belongings and prepared to leave the retreat house. Brother Francis met me at the front door, his expression knowing but not surprised. In the daylight he looked older than I'd realized, worn down by years of shepherding lost souls through their private darkness. "You're going back," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, but not to what I left behind, to what comes next. He nodded, understanding the distinction. The man who'd arrived at the retreat house 3 days ago had been running from himself. The one leaving was running towards something, not away from the wreckage of his old life, but toward the possibility of building something authentic from the pieces. "What about the others?" I asked, thinking of the hollow-eyed permanent residents, the ones who chose to stay. "They made their own choice. Sometimes the only peace we can find is in surrender." Brother Francis smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "But sometimes the braver choice is to fight for what we've lost." I walked away from the retreat house with the rosary in my pocket, each bead a reminder of the man I'd chosen to become again. The world outside looked the same streets, the same sky, the same problems waiting to be solved. But I was different, not because I'd been visited by something supernatural, and not because I'd conquered my demons, because I'd stopped running for myself. The apartment I returned to was still empty, the divorce papers still unsigned on the kitchen table. But as I sat down to read them, really read them, not just skim the legal language, while my mind was elsewhere, I realized that signing them wouldn't be an ending. It would be a beginning. Outside my window, the city moved at its usual frantic pace, full of people wearing careful masks and playing familiar roles. I thought of the faceless man and wondered how many of them were haunted by their own abandoned selves. How many carried the weight of decades of small compromises and forgotten dreams. But that was their journey to make. Mine was just beginning. I picked up a pen and signed my name, my real name, written in handwriting that looked like my father's but felt entirely my own. Each letter was a choice, each word a small act of reclamation. When I was finished, I pulled the rosary from my pocket and held it up to the afternoon light. The beads glowed softly, 59 points of warm luminescence strung together on a cord that felt strong enough to last a lifetime. Or however long it took to remember who I really was. The clicking sound was completely gone. Story 5. The amber globe appeared on my desk 3 nights after the incident, though I couldn't remember what incident that was supposed to be. It sat there like a malignant eye, catching the lamplight and throwing it back in wavering honeycombed patterns across my study walls. I should have thrown it away immediately. Instead, I found myself reaching for it every few minutes, my fingers drawn to its warm, smooth surface. Despite the chill that seemed to emanate from within, the first night, I simply held it. The second night, it began to pulse with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. By the third night, when sleep had become impossible and my reflection in the bathroom mirror showed eyes that belonged to someone else, the globe started to pull, not physically, though my rational mind insisted that was impossible. The pull was deeper than that, a gravitational tug that seemed to originate somewhere behind my sternum and extend invisible threads toward the window. I found myself standing there at 2:47 a.m., the globe warm in my palms, staring out at the cypress grove that bordered my property. Trees I'd never paid attention to before now seemed to lean toward my house with deliberate intent, their dark silhouettes reaching like arthritic fingers against the star-scattered sky. The pull grew stronger. I dressed mechanically, moving through my bedroom like a sleepwalker, though I felt hyper-aware of every sensation. The scratch of wool against my skin, the cold hardwood beneath my bare feet, the way my breath created small clouds in air that shouldn't have been that cold in October. The central heating had been working fine just hours earlier, but now the house felt like a tomb, all stone and stagnant air outside, the night wrapped around me like wet silk. The amber globe in my jacket pocket seemed to generate its own heat, a persistent warmth that spread up my arm and into my chest cavity. Each step toward the cypress grove felt both voluntary and inevitable, as if I were walking along tracks laid down long before my birth. The trees were older than I'd realized. Their trunks, gnarled and massive, bore the scars of decades-long vertical gouges that looked disturbingly like claw marks, though no animal in these parts could have made them. Spanish moss hung from their branches like funeral shrouds, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the starlight. The air beneath the trees was thick and humid, tasting of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers left too long in a vase. The globe pulsed more insistently now, its amber light visible even through the fabric of my jacket. I pulled it out and held it before me like a compass, watching as its glow intensified and dimmed in what seemed like directional guidance. When I turned left, the light faded. When I faced deeper into the grove, it blazed brighter, casting dancing shadows on the cypress bark that moved independently of my movements. I followed its lead, the path, if it could be called, that wound between the massive tree trunks. In a pattern that defied logic, we seemed to be walking in circles, yet each turn revealed new territory, deeper groves where the moss hung thicker and the air grew more oppressive. My watch had stopped at 333, its digital display frozen as if time itself had given up. Within the bounds of this place, the smell of smoke reached me before I saw the structure, not the clean scent of a fireplace or campfire, but the acrid odor of things that shouldn't burn, metal and stone, and something organic that made my stomach turn. The amber globe's light had grown so bright that I no longer needed to look at it for guidance. Its glow illuminated a rough circle around me, turning the cypress bark golden and creating pockets of warmth in the cold night air. The cabin appeared between one step and the next, as if it had materialized from the smoke itself. It was smaller than I'd expected, barely large enough for 2 rooms constructed from rough honeyed logs that looked far older than the surrounding trees. No lights showed in its single visible window, yet smoke continued to pour from a chimney that seemed to bend and twist against the sky like a living thing. The door stood slightly ajar. I approached slowly the amber globe, now so hot in my hands that it nearly burned. Yet I couldn't bring myself to let it go. The wood of the porch creaked under my weight with sounds that seemed to echo longer than they should, as if the sound waves were trapped in the thick air and reverberating endlessly through the crack in the door. I could see the flicker of firelight, though no warmth emanated from within. The interior was a single room dominated by a stone fireplace where flames danced without consuming any visible fuel. The floor was covered with papers. Hundreds of them scattered like autumn leaves but blackened around the edges as if they'd been pulled from the fire before complete destruction. They rustled without any breeze to move them, creating a constant whisper that sounded almost like conversation in a language I couldn't quite understand. I knelt among the papers, setting the amber globe beside me, where it continued to pulse with that steady heartbeat rhythm. The documents were letters, all of them written in dozens of different hands on various types of paper, some on expensive stationery, others on pages torn from notebooks, a few on what looked like napkins or scraps of cardboard. The ink had run on many of them, creating watercolor smears. That might have been tears, but enough remained legible for me to piece together their contents. They were apologies, all of them. "I'm sorry for what I did to Margaret. I should have stopped him. Please forgive me. I didn't know what would happen when I signed those papers. The money wasn't worth it. God help me. The money wasn't worth what they did to those families. I can't sleep anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. Please, if you're reading this, know that I'm sorry." Each letter I touched seemed to ignite at my fingertips, not with flame, but with something that resembled fire, yet cast no heat. The burning papers lifted from the floor like luminescent butterflies, their forms wavering between solid matter and pure light. They hovered around me, circling at shoulder height, and as they moved, they began to whisper. Not the rustling whisper of paper on paper, but actual voices, dozens of them all speaking at once in tones of desperate confession and plea. The voices were clear enough that I could distinguish individual words, but they overlapped and intertwined until they became a chorus of guilt that made my skin crawl and my pulse quicken. December 15th, 2025, one voice hissed near my left ear. March 3rd, 2026, whispered another from somewhere behind my head. August 22nd, 2025, breathed a third so close I could feel the non-existent breath on my neck. Dates, they were giving me dates, all of them in the future. All spoken with the certainty of prophecy rather than prediction. The floating papers, will of the wisps. Now I realized, though I'd never seen such things before, continued their orbit around me. Their whispered dates, creating a calendar of events that hadn't happened yet but apparently would. The certainty in their voices was absolute and terrifying. I stood too quickly, my head spinning from the motion, and the overwhelming input of voices and dates and glowing papers that shouldn't exist. The amber globe rolled across the floor, its light dimming as it moved away from me, and in the growing darkness, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. The fireplace was empty. No flames danced in the stone cavity, no embers glowed among non-existent logs. The light I'd been seeing, the flickering that had drawn me into the cabin, had been coming from the will of the wisps themselves, their combined glow creating the illusion of a fire that had never been lit. The whispered dates continued, growing more insistent, more urgent. I could feel the weight of future knowledge pressing against my consciousness, like water against a dam. Dates that meant nothing to me now, but apparently would mean everything. When they arrived, the will of the wisps circled faster, their light growing brighter, and their voices began to overlap until they became a single, unified whisper that seemed to come from inside my own head. "You were supposed to be here," they said in unison. "You were always supposed to be here." I stumbled toward the door, leaving the amber globe behind, no longer caring about its warmth or guidance. The cool night air outside the cabin felt like salvation, but as I turned back to look at the structure, I just fled. My relief transformed into something far worse than fear. The cabin cast no shadow. The moon hung full and bright overhead, throwing everything else in the grove into sharp relief. The cypress trees, the hanging moss, even the scattered fallen leaves on the ground, all projected clear, dark shadows in the silver light. But the cabin sat in the landscape like a photograph double exposed onto reality, substantial enough to enter but somehow not quite present enough to block the moonlight that should have been streaming behind it. I walked around the structure testing this impossibility from different angles. From every direction, the moonlight passed through the cabin as if it were made of glass. Yet I could still see it clearly, could still see the smoke rising from its crooked chimney, could still hear the whispered dates emanating from within its walls. October 31st, 2025. The voices called after me as I backed away. November 15th, 2025. January 8th, 2026. You can't unhear us now. The dates followed me through the cypress grove, echoing between the trees. Even as I quickened my pace, the will of the wisps had somehow followed me outside the cabin. Their glow, visible through the gaps in the tree canopy, circling overhead like luminous vultures. Their whispered prophecies created a soundtrack to my retreat. Each date burned into my memory with the persistence of physical pain. By the time I reached my house, dawn was beginning to bleed across the eastern horizon, though my watch still read 333. I locked the door behind me and drew every curtain, but the dates continued to echo in my mind and I could still see the faint glow of the will of the wisps through the fabric of the drapes. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, the first date has passed October 31st, 2025, Halloween night, when my neighbor's house burned down while the family was away at a costume party. No one was hurt, but the fire department couldn't explain how it started and the insurance investigator found evidence that suggested the blaze had begun in multiple locations simultaneously, as if someone had deliberately said it. But I know better. I know it started the moment I touched that first letter in the shadowless cabin, when the whispered date first branded itself into my consciousness. I know because I watched from my window as the flames began and in their dancing light I could see the shapes of burning papers circling overhead, casting no shadows of their own. November 15th is approaching. I've been watching the news, reading the local paper, paying attention to every detail of daily life in ways I never did before. Waiting to see what calamity the will of the wisps have prophesied for that date, waiting to discover what role I meant to play in events that were set in motion the night I followed an amber globe into a grove of cypress trees. The globe is gone now, but I don't need it anymore. I can feel the pull returning stronger each night as November 15th approaches, the same gravitational tug that led me to the cabin the first time. Only now it doesn't pull me toward the cypress grove. It pulls me toward the house on Maple Street, where the Hendersons live with their 2 teenage sons. The house with the yellow shutters in the garden that Mrs. Henderson tends so carefully. The house that will burn on November 15th at exactly 11:47 p.m. According to the whispered prophecy that plays on endless loop in my mind, I tell myself I could warn them. I could call the fire department, report a gas leak, do something to prevent what the will of the wisps have foretold. But deep down I know the truth that I've been avoiding for 3 weeks now. The same truth I saw reflected in the amber globe before I left it behind in that shadowless cabin. I'm not here to prevent these events. I'm here to cause them. The burned letters weren't apologies for past sins. They were apologies for future ones, written by people like me who had been guided by amber light to discover what they were destined to become. The will of the wisps weren't prophesying random future disasters. They were providing a schedule of tasks that needed to be completed by someone who no longer cast a shadow under the moonlight, someone who had touched those letters and absorbed the guilt they contained, becoming a vessel for the completion of unfinished business that stretched back generations. I understand now why the cabin had no shadow. It wasn't truly there, not in any physical sense. It was a way station, a place where the boundary between intention and action grows thin, where people like me are recruited for work that the living cannot do and the dead cannot complete. 3 days until November 15th. 3 days until I discover whether the Henderson house will burn because of faulty wiring or because I help it, along with a book of matches and a can of gasoline. 3 days to find out if I'm losing my mind or if I'm about to become exactly what those whispered confessions warned me I would be. The will of the wisps are circling outside my window again tonight. Their glow visible even through the drawn curtains. They're not whispering dates anymore, now they're whispering instructions. Their voices patient and persistent and absolutely certain that I will follow their guidance when the time comes. The amber globe may be gone, but the pull it created remains growing stronger as each prophesied date approaches. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in a voice that sounds exactly like my own, I can hear myself composing the apology letter I'll write after November 15th. Another confession to be burned and scattered on the floor of a cabin that casts no shadow, waiting for the next person to find it and begin their own journey toward understanding what they were always meant to become. I'm sorry for what I did to the Hendersons. The letter will say, I should have fought harder against what I was becoming. Please forgive me. I didn't know the pull would be so strong, or that the dates would be so specific, or that crossing that threshold would change everything about who I thought I was. But I'm writing it now before November 15th arrives, because I can feel the certainty settling into my bones like winter cold. The will of the wisps are no longer content to circle outside my window. They're pressing against the glass. Now. Their glow bright enough to read by, and their whispered instructions are becoming impossible to ignore. The matches are in the kitchen drawer, the gasoline is in the garage. The Hendersons' house is only 6 blocks away, and tomorrow night, at exactly 11:47 p.m., I'm going to discover whether I'm a man losing his sanity to guilt and paranoia, or something else entirely, something that was recruited in a shadowless cabin to finish work that was started long before I was born. Either way, this letter will join the others on that cabin floor, waiting to transform into light and whisper its warnings to whoever finds the next amber globe and follows its guidance through the cypress trees to discover what they were always meant to become. The pull is getting stronger. November 15th is almost here. Story 6. The first drop hit my forehead like a cold finger jolting me from sleep. I lay motionless in my tent, listening to the Iowa wilderness breathe around me. The subtle rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a night bee bird, the whisper of wind through branches. Then another drop, heavier, this time striking the tent fabric with a wet slap that shouldn't exist in a cloudless night. I unzipped the tent flap and peered into the darkness. The forest canopy stretched above me, a black lacework against stars. And as my eyes adjusted, I saw them glistening droplets falling from the treetops like slow, deliberate tears. They caught what little moonlight filtered through the leaves, each one a tiny silver beacon announcing its descent. The smell hit me before I could retreat. Earth rich and loamy. The scent of soil turned fresh by rain that had never fallen. But underneath that familiar aroma lurked something else, something synthetic and artificial that made my throat tighten: shampoo. The drops were shampoo falling from trees that had no business producing anything but sap and dew. I crawled from my tent bare feet, finding the forest floor damp with more than morning moisture. The drops continued their rhythmic descent, pattering against leaves and striking my skin with a consistency that felt almost deliberate. Each impact carried that same earthy chemical fragrance, and I found myself following the increasing concentration of droplets as they led deeper into the woods. The trail was unmistakable once I recognized it, a pathway marked not by broken twigs or disturbed undergrowth, but by the increasing frequency of those impossible tears from above. Every few steps, another drop would strike my shoulder, my head, the ground before my feet, as if the trees themselves were guiding me forward with their strange secretions. My rational mind offered explanations: illegal dumping, some kind of environmental contamination, perhaps a ruptured pipe from a nearby facility I hadn't known existed, but this deep in the lowest hills state forest, 20 m from the nearest road. Such conveniences felt as unlikely as the alternative explanations. My brain refused to fully form. The sandstone cave appeared gradually, its mouth yawning open like a wound. In the hillside, the shampoo drops seemed to converge here, their trail becoming a steady stream that disappeared into the darkness beyond the entrance. I stood at the threshold, my skin prickling with more than the night's chill. And that's when I heard it: laughter, soft, muffled, but unmistakably human. It echoed from somewhere deep within the cave, bouncing off stone walls, until it became something distorted and strange. Not quite the sound of joy, not quite the sound of madness, but something caught between the two that made my spine feel like ice. Water was trickling down it. I should have left. Every instinct screamed: retreat, return to the tent, pack up and drive back to Des Moines, where strange liquids fell only from broken faucets, and laughter came from recognizable sources. Instead, I found myself drawn forward, one step and then another, following that chemical earth trail, into the cave's embrace. The darkness was absolute, forcing me to navigate by touch and sound. The walls were smooth sandstone worn by centuries of water and wind into organic curves that felt almost alive under my fingertips. The laughter continued, always seeming to come from just around the next bend, just beyond the reach of my vision. That's when I discovered the first hairbrush. My foot caught on something plastic and irregular, sending it skittering across the stone floor. I knelt and groped until my fingers closed around the familiar shape, a paddle brush with synthetic bristles, the kind sold in every drugstore across America. But this one was wrong. Somehow the bristles were matted with what felt like moss and small twigs, and when I lifted it closer to my face, it carried that same earthy shampoo scent that permeated the forest above. I stumbled backward, dropping the brush, but my retreat was short-lived. Another brush lay just behind me and another to my left. As my eyes slowly adjusted to the cave's gloom, I began to make out their shapes scattered across the floor like the abandoned tools of some impossible grooming ritual. The laughter grew closer. I fled, then stumbling through the darkness, my hands scraping against stone walls as I sought the entrance. But the cave seemed longer on the way out, its passage more twisted. And when I finally burst into the night air, my lungs burning with exertion and panic, I found something that stopped me, cold. The forest had changed. Every tree trunk bore scratch marks, long parallel grooves, as if something massive had dragged claws or bristles down their bark. The marks were fresh white wood gleaming in the starlight, and they ran in perfect vertical lines from as high as I could see down to the earth itself. But it was the roots that made my knees weak. Protruding from the soil around each tree's base were dozens of hairbrushes, their handles jutting up like the cemetery markers of some bizarre burial ground. Paddle brushes, round brushes, detangling combs, all driven into the earth with a force that had buried them to their necks, leaving only enough exposed to identify what they were. The shampoo drops continued to fall, and now I could see their source high in the canopy. Shapes moved, human shapes or things that might once have been human, perched in the branches like enormous birds. They worked with methodical precision, applying long strokes to something I couldn't quite see, and with each downward pull of their arms, more of that fragrant liquid rained down. They were combing the forest. I stood transfixed, watching the impossible scene unfold above me. The figures I counted at least 6, though the shadows made it difficult to be certain. Moved with the practiced efficiency of beauticians, their motions smooth and professional. They seemed to be working on the trees themselves, running brushes through bark and leaves, as if styling an enormous green manner. The laughter resumed, and this time I could place its source. It came from the figures above, a soft giggling that might have been pleasant in any other context. They were enjoying their work, finding genuine pleasure in their impossible task of grooming the wilderness. One of them noticed me. It paused in its brushing its head, turning to look down at me with what might have been curiosity. Even in the darkness, I could see the gleam of teeth in what could have been a smile. Then it raised one hand, the one not holding a brush, and waved at me with the casual friendliness of a neighbor spotted across a yard. I ran behind me. The laughter increased, becoming a chorus of amusement that followed me back to my campsite. But even as I stuffed my gear into my backpack with trembling hands, even as I told myself that exhaustion and stress had finally caught up with my overworked mind, I could feel them watching me. The sensation was like fingers tracing my spine, a constant awareness of eyes tracking my every movement. The shampoo drops continued to fall as I packed each one. A small reminder that whatever I had seen, whatever I thought I had seen, was not finished with me. Yet they struck my tent, my gear, my skin, each impact carrying that impossible scent of earth and chemicals that no rational explanation could account for. I made it to my car just as dawn began to gray the eastern sky. The engine turned over on the first try, and I had never been more grateful for the mundane reliability of machinery. But as I drove away from the campsite, my headlights sweeping across the forest. One last time I saw something that made me slam on the brakes. Every tree I passed bore fresh brush marks, and buried around their roots were hundreds of hairbrushes, their handles glinting in my headlights like accusing fingers. The grooming had expanded, spreading beyond the cave's immediate vicinity to encompass acres of woodland and perched in every visible tree. Still working with patient dedication were the figures. They paused in their labor just long enough to wave at me as I passed their gestures, carrying the same friendly acknowledgement as before. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. The radio stayed off. I couldn't bear the thought of human voices when my own sanity felt so fragile. Instead, I listened to the sound of my tires on asphalt and tried to convince myself that isolation and fatigue had conspired to create an elaborate hallucination. But 3 days later, my hair began to fall out, not all at once, but in steady streams that clogged my shower drain and covered my pillow. Each morning, when I looked in the mirror, I could see thin patches spreading across my scalp like crop circles. In reverse, the dermatologist found no medical cause, no signs of disease or deficiency that might explain the sudden loss. And every night I dream of brushes. In my dreams I am back in that forest, but this time I am not on the ground. Looking up, I am in the canopy, my fingers wrapped around the handle of a brush that gleams with impossible cleanliness. Below me spreads an endless forest that needs tending, trees whose bark must be smoothed and whose leaves require careful arrangement. The work is satisfying in a way I can't explain, each stroke of the brush bringing order to chaos, beauty to wildness. My companions work beside me, their laughter, soft and content, as we transform the landscape, one careful stroke at a time. And sometimes when I wake with my pillow covered in fallen hair, I think I can still smell that earth-rich shampoo clinging to the strands. Sometimes I catch myself humming while I shower a wordless melody that seems to match the rhythm of brushing. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, working through the night to groom the wilderness into something more pleasing, more civilized. Sometimes I wonder if they're waiting for me to come back to take my place among them, in the canopy where the real work gets done, and sometimes in the deepest part of the night when sleep refuses to come. I find myself planning the drive back to Iowa, back to that forest reserve where impossible things fall from trees and laughter echoes from stone caves. After all, my hair could use a good brushing. Story 7. The isolation was supposed to heal me. That's what Dr. Henley had recommended after the breakdown: complete separation from the noise, the pressure, the constant weight of expectations that had crushed me into that hospital bed. The mountain cabin seemed perfect. 3 weeks of nothing but pine-scented air and the distant murmur of a creek threading through granite boulders. I'd been there 4 days when I started leaving the chocolates. It wasn't planned. I brought a box of expensive truffles, Belgian things wrapped in delicate gold foil that crinkled like autumn leaves between my fingers. The first night, exhausted from unpacking, I'd simply left them on the kitchen counter before collapsing into bed. When I woke, I found myself disappointed to see them untouched, though I couldn't explain why I'd expected otherwise. The second night I arranged them more deliberately, a small pyramid of golden spheres catching the lamplight, positioned precisely in the center of the weathered wooden surface. I told myself it was aesthetics, a small pleasure in an otherwise empty routine. But as I lay in bed that night, I found myself listening for what I couldn't say. The morning revealed the first impossibility. The chocolates were gone, but the foil wrappers remained, not scattered or torn, but folded. Each piece of golden paper had been carefully manipulated into tiny, intricate origami figures, birds, I thought, or perhaps flowers. They sat in a perfect line along the counter's edge, no larger than my thumbnail, their metallic surfaces catching the early sunlight streaming through the kitchen window. My hands trembled as I examined them. The folding was precise, professional, each crease sharp enough to cut each angle mathematically perfect. I'd seen origami before, but never anything this small, this detailed. The work would have required hours, steady hands, and microscopic attention to detail. I lived alone. The nearest neighbor was 3 down a winding, dirt road. The rational mind seeks rational explanations. Perhaps I'd eaten the chocolates myself in some fugue state, brought on by the medication adjustments Dr. Henley had prescribed. Perhaps my subconscious had created the origami figures during a sleepwalking episode, though I'd never displayed such artistic skill while conscious, let alone while unconscious. But rationality felt thin up here, stretched like morning mist across the valley below. That evening I laid out more chocolates. This time I counted them, 12 perfect spheres arranged in 3 rows of 4. I positioned a notepad nearby and sketched their exact placement, documenting angles and distances like a crime scene investigator. Before bed, I even scattered flour lightly across the floor around the counter. If someone was entering my cabin, they'd leave footprints. Sleep came fitfully. I dreamed of tiny hands working in darkness, of whispered conversations in a language that sounded like rustling paper. Twice I woke certain I'd heard movement in the kitchen, but when I crept to the doorway I found only shadows and the soft ticking of the wall clock. Dawn brought the second impossibility. The chocolates were gone. The flour remained undisturbed. Not a single footprint marred its white surface, but the origami figures had multiplied dozens of them, now perhaps hundreds each no larger than AP. They formed intricate patterns across the counter, spirals within spirals, geometric mandalas that seemed to shift and breathe in my peripheral vision, and they were pointing not obviously nothing so crude as arrows or directional symbols, but there was an unmistakable flow to their arrangement, a current that drew the eye inexorably toward the narrow hallway leading deeper into the cabin. Following that golden stream, I found myself standing before a door I'd barely noticed during my first days here, the basement entrance. I'd assumed it was a closet, maybe storage for the owner's belongings. The door was solid oak, fitted with an old-fashioned brass lock that had seemed more decorative than functional. Now I found myself studying it with new attention, running my fingers along its edges, pressing my ear against the wood. From the other side came the sound that would haunt my remaining nights, a dry, methodical crunching, punctuated by soft clicking sounds that might have been a tongue working against teeth. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost musical. Crunch, click, click, crunch, click, click. Like someone savoring something delicious in the darkness below, I tried the handle locked as expected. The brass felt cold under my palm, cold enough to sting, despite the cabin's warmth. When I pulled my hand away, my fingerprints remained etched in what looked like frost. Though the metal had felt dry to the touch, the sounds continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then faded into silence, so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. Over the following days, the pattern established itself with clockwork precision. Each evening I would arrange the chocolates, sometimes 12, sometimes 24, once an entire layer covering the counter surface. Each morning I would find them transformed into increasingly elaborate origami displays, all pointing toward that locked basement door. And always just after dawn came the sounds from below, that patient, satisfied crunching. I began to document everything: timestamps, temperature readings, detailed sketches of each origami arrangement. The figures were becoming more complex, more unsettling. What had begun as simple birds and flowers evolved into shapes that hurt to look at directly, geometries that seemed to fold in on themselves, creating optical illusions that left me dizzy and disoriented. The pointing became more insistent too, where the early arrangements had suggested direction through subtle flow. The newer displays formed explicit arrows, hands with extended fingers, even what appeared to be miniature compasses with golden needles, all aligned toward the basement door. My sleep suffered. Every night brought dreams of descending stairs, of finding something waiting in the darkness below. I would wake with the taste of chocolate on my tongue, though I hadn't eaten any. In days, the crunching sounds grew louder, more frequent. Sometimes they seemed to come from directly beneath my bed, as if whatever lived below was following my movements through the floorboards. On the 10th night I decided to stay awake. I positioned myself in the living room with a clear view of the kitchen, armed with a thermos of coffee and a notebook. The chocolates sat in their usual arrangement, a simple circle, this time 24 pieces forming a perfect ring. I would catch whatever was doing this document. It proved to myself that there was a rational explanation. The hours crawled by. Midnight came and went. My eyes burned from staring at the counter, but I refused to blink for more than a few seconds. At a time, nothing moved. The cabin was silent, except for the wind in the pines outside and my own breathing. At 3:17 a.m. I noticed the first change. One of the chocolates was gone, not moved, not disturbed, simply absent, as if it had never existed. The circle remained perfect, but now consisted of 23 pieces instead of 24. I hadn't seen it happen. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't. Another vanished at 3:23, then two more at 331. Each disappearance occurred in the split second between one heartbeat and the next. During that inevitable microsecond when human attention wavers, I tried focusing on individual chocolates, but somehow the ones I wasn't watching would vanish while I was concentrating elsewhere. By 4 a.m. they were all gone. The origami began materializing. Immediately afterward, golden specks appeared like stars being born, growing from nothing into complex folded shapes that seemed to assemble themselves from pure intention. The process was beautiful and terrifying, creation without creator, art without artist. This time the arrangement was unmistakable. Every single figure pointed directly at the basement door, not just in general direction but with mathematical precision, as if guided by invisible surveying equipment. They formed a golden river flowing across the counter, down the cabinet faces, across the floor, leading in a perfectly straight line to that locked oak barrier. And from below came new sounds, not just crunching now, but what sounded almost like conversation. Multiple voices, perhaps, though, too muffled to make out words. The rhythm suggested questions and answers, statements and responses, sometimes laughter soft, dry, like pages rustling in an old book. I approached the door with steps that felt like walking through quicksand. The brass handle was so cold it burned, but I grasped it anyway, turning until the mechanism clicked, still locked. But now I could hear breathing on the other side, slow, patient, as if something was waiting just beyond the threshold. "Who's there?" I whispered. The sound stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed solid, a wall of nothingness that pressed against my consciousness. Then, just as I was about to step away, came a single sound that froze my blood, the soft scraping of fingernails against wood, drawing slowly across the door's inner surface. I fled to my bedroom and didn't emerge until well past noon. The final week brought escalation. The origami figures began appearing throughout the cabin, not just in the kitchen, but scattered across surfaces like golden snowflakes. They accumulated in corners, drifted under furniture, clung to window screens like metallic insects, all pointed toward the basement, creating a three-dimensional compass that turned my home into a directional maze. The sounds from below grew bolder. I could hear footsteps now, or what might have been footsteps if they weren't so strangely rhythmic, so deliberately placed. They followed patterns: 7 steps pause, 3 steps pause, 1 step pause over and over, like a code being tapped out in percussion. I stopped leaving chocolates, but it made no difference. The origami continued to appear, folded from materials. I couldn't identify scraps of paper. I'd never seen fragments of what looked like aged parchment, even pieces that seemed to be made from compressed flower petals or leaf fragments. The work grew more sophisticated, daily, evolving from simple figures into architectural models of impossible buildings, anatomical diagrams of creatures that shouldn't exist, star charts of unfamiliar constellations. My rational mind was crumbling. I found myself checking doors and windows compulsively, though I could never remember locking them. Food disappeared from my refrigerator in precise portions. Always enough for 2 people, never for 1. I would discover muddy footprints on my floor, perfectly sized to match my own boots, though I hadn't worn them indoors. The breaking point came on my 19th night. I woke to find my bedroom filled with origami figures. They covered every surface: the dresser, the nightstand, the window, still thousands of tiny golden shapes creating a miniature cityscape of impossible architecture. They had arranged themselves in concentric circles around my bed, and in the moonlight streaming through the window, they seemed to pulse with their own inner light. All of them pointed down through the floor toward the basement. I rose from bed as if sleepwalking my feet, finding clear paths between the origami formations. They led me through the cabin like runway lights, guiding my steps with golden precision. The basement door stood open. I don't remember unlocking it. The brass handle was warm, now almost hot, and turned freely in my grip. Beyond the threshold lay a staircase descending into darkness, so complete it seemed to have weight and texture. The air rising from below carried impossible scents: chocolate and cinnamon, old paper and pine needles, the metallic tang of fresh snow. From the depths came a sound I recognized but couldn't place, a gentle rustling like someone turning pages in a book or perhaps unfolding paper, working with delicate precision on some intricate creation that required perfect darkness to complete come down. A voice whispered from below, or perhaps it was just the wind in the pines outside, coincidentally forming syllables that sounded like invitation. I placed 1 foot on the first step. The wood was warm, almost alive under my bare sole. Another step. The darkness seemed to part before me, creating a tunnel of slightly lesser black that suggested a path forward. Behind me, throughout the cabin, I could hear the origami figures stirring a sound like autumn leaves in a gentle breeze or rain on a tin roof or 1,000 tiny wings beating. In perfect synchronization, they were moving, rearranging themselves, creating new patterns and new meanings. In my absence, I took another step down. The basement was larger than it should have been, larger than the cabin's foundation could possibly accommodate. In the darkness, I could sense vast spaces opening around me, chambers and corridors extending far beyond the property's boundaries. The air was warm and sweet, filled with the scent of chocolate and something else, something organic and alive, like breath or skin or the inside of someone's mouth. Shapes moved in the darkness, not threatening but purposeful. I could hear them working that familiar crunching sound, but softer now, more careful, like artisans perfecting their craft. The rustling of paper being folded and refolded, the whispered conversations in languages made of texture and temperature rather than words. A light appeared ahead of me, not electric, but warm and golden, like candle light filtered through amber. It illuminated a workshop of sorts, tables covered with tools I couldn't identify, shelves lined with containers holding what looked like starlight and compressed moonbeams. And everywhere, the origami figures. Not just the simple ones I'd found upstairs, but elaborate creations of impossible complexity, cities of folded paper, forests of metallic trees, entire civilizations crafted from candy wrappers and love notes and pages torn from books I'd never read. At the center of it all sat a figure I almost recognized, human in shape but wrong in proportion, with fingers too long and eyes too bright. It looked up from its work, a origami dragon so detailed I could see individual scales, and smiled with teeth like pearls. "You've been so generous," it said, and its voice was the sound of paper being carefully folded. "So patient. Not everyone appreciates craftsmanship these days." I tried to speak, but no words came. The figure gestured to the workshop around us, to the thousands of creations that filled the impossible space. "All from your gifts," it continued, "each wrapper, a new possibility, each piece of foil, a fresh canvas. You understand the value of small things, don't you? The beauty that can emerge from what others discard." Behind me, I could hear movement on the stairs, more figures descending, or perhaps ascending. The boundary between up and down seemed negotiable here, subject to revision based on need or whim. "You could stay," the figure suggested, returning to its work. "There's so much to create, so many stories to fold into being, and you clearly have an appreciation for the process." I watched its fingers move with inhuman precision, each fold creating new possibilities, new realities. The dragon in its hands was becoming something else, a flower, perhaps, or a star, or a face I thought I might recognize. The offer hung in the air like incense, sweet and compelling around me. The workshop hummed with creative energy. I could feel inspiration flowing through the space, like electricity, like blood, like the breath of sleeping giants. This was where impossible things were born, where the discarded and forgotten were transformed into art. Part of me wanted to accept, to learn the techniques that could fold reality like paper, that could create meaning from trash and beauty, from abandonment, to join this community of craftsmen working in the spaces between what is and what could be. But another part, the part that still remembered sunlight and the taste of morning coffee, turned away from the light, climbed back up those warm wooden stairs, emerged into a cabin that suddenly felt small and ordinary and heartbreakingly real. I left the next morning throwing my belongings into the car, without ceremony or careful packing. The origami figures remained throughout the cabin, but they no longer pointed toward the basement. Instead they seemed to wave goodbye, tiny golden hands flickering in the morning light. As I drove down the mountain road, I glanced in the rear-view mirror to see the cabin. One last time smoke was rising from the chimney, though I was certain I'd extinguished the fire. And there, barely visible in the kitchen window, stood a figure that might have been human. It raised one impossibly long hand in farewell, then stepped back into shadows that seemed deeper than the room should have allowed. "I've been back in the city for 3 months now. Dr. Henley says I'm making excellent progress. The medication is helping, the dreams are less frequent. I've returned to work, to routine, to the comfortable boundaries of normal life. But sometimes when I'm opening mail or unwrapping a gift, I find myself folding the paper afterward. Just simple shapes at first, birds, flowers, the basic forms everyone learns in elementary school. But my fingers seemed to remember techniques I never learned, creating increasingly complex figures. That shouldn't be possible with my limited skill. And sometimes late at night, when the city is as quiet as it ever gets, I think I can hear that familiar sound, the gentle crunching of someone enjoying a chocolate in the darkness, followed by the soft rustle of paper being folded into impossible shapes. I've started buying chocolates again, expensive ones wrapped in gold foil. I tell myself they're for the office, for client meetings, for the small social obligations that fill a normal life. But I always seem to have extras, and I always seem to leave them on my kitchen counter, arranged in patterns that feel somehow significant, somehow necessary, just in case story 8. The engine coughed once, twice, then died with the finality of a last breath. The sudden silence was deafening. After hours of steady rumbling, leaving only the whisper of cooling metal and the distant howl of wind through the trees lining Clinton Road, my headlight carved a pale cone through the darkness ahead, illuminating perhaps 30 feet of cracked asphalt. Before surrendering to the impenetrable black that seemed to press against the glass like something alive, I coasted to a stop, the motorcycle's momentum carrying me just far enough to reach what appeared to be a small clearing on the roadside. The kickstand clicked into place with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud. In the stillness, I pulled off my helmet and immediately regretted it. The night air struck my face like a cold slap, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something metallic, that made my stomach clench. That's when I noticed the phone booth. It stood maybe 20 feet from where I'd stopped. Bathed in the weak spillover from my headlight, red paint gleamed wetly in the dim illumination, though I couldn't recall seeing rain. The booth appeared pristine, as if it had been placed there moments before my arrival. Yet something about its presence felt impossibly ancient. No wires connected it to anything. No utility lines ran to or from the structure. Most unsettling of all, there was no signage, no phone, company logo, no instructions for use, no rates posted anywhere on its surface. The silence stretched until my ears began to ring. I fumbled for my cell phone, knowing already what I would find: no signal. The screen showed a single bar. Then nothing. Then flickered between emergency calls only and complete dead zones. Clinton Road had always been notorious for poor reception, but this felt different, deliberate. Somehow a sound pierced the quiet, sharp electronic insistent. The phone booth was ringing. The sound came in measured intervals, each ring seeming to echo longer than physics should allow. I found myself counting without conscious intent. 1, 2, 3, 4. The silence between rings felt pregnant with possibility, as if the darkness itself was holding its breath. 5, 6, 7, 8. I approached the booth slowly, my boots crunching on gravel that I couldn't see but could feel shifting beneath my feet. The metal handle was surprisingly warm. When I pulled the door open, the hinges, groaning in protest, despite the booth's apparent newness, the interior smelled of copper, pennies, and ozone, sharp and clean in a way that made my sinuses burn. The handset hung heavy in my grip. As I lifted it to my ear, the expected dial tone never came. Instead I heard static, not the white noise of a bad connection, but something more organic, almost like breathing. Beneath the static, patterns began to emerge, forming what might have been words if I listened carefully enough. Look at the speedometer. The static seemed to whisper. The sound came from impossibly far away, as if traveling through layers of reality to reach me. Look at the speedometer. I glanced back at my motorcycle, its dashboard still dimly lit by residual battery power. The speedometer read 0, as expected for a stationary vehicle, but below it the odometer glowed with steady numbers, 47,482 miles. Nothing unusual about that. I'd been keeping track of the bike's mileage religiously since purchasing it used 3 months ago. The static in the phone shifted, becoming more insistent. Look again, it seemed to say, though the words never quite formed completely, always, almost words, always just beyond the threshold of understanding. I looked. The odometer now read 47381. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked hard, certain I'd misread the display. Digital readouts didn't just change on their own, especially not in the wrong direction. Odometers measured total distance traveled. They increased, never decreased. It was a fundamental law of automotive reality, as reliable as gravity or the passage of time. But there it was, 47,381, 1 mile less than before. The static in the phone booth crackled. With what might have been amusement, I pressed the handset tighter against my ear, straining to make sense of the sounds flowing through the connection. Sometimes they almost resolved into intelligible speech, but whenever I focused directly on them, they slipped away like smoke. The night around me felt different. Now, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up beneath my leather jacket, the darkness beyond my headlight seemed denser, more substantial, as if it were not merely the absence of light but a presence in its own right. I had the distinct sensation of being watched, though I could see nothing beyond the small circle of illumination surrounding my motorcycle and the phone booth. I forced myself to look at the odometer again, 47,380. The number had dropped another mile while I wasn't watching. This was impossible, even if the display was malfunctioning. Odometers didn't count backward, they couldn't. The mechanical and electronic systems simply weren't designed to work in reverse. The static in the phone shifted again, taking on an almost musical quality. I found myself leaning into the booth, drawn by patterns that seemed just on the verge of meaning. The metal walls felt warm against my shoulders, as if the structure were generating its own heat. The warmth was comforting at first, then gradually became oppressive, like being inside something's mouth. When I next checked the odometer, it read 47,379. My hands began to shake. I set the phone handset back in its cradle, but the static continued, now seeming to emanate from the air itself rather than the device. The booth's door had somehow closed behind me without my noticing, and when I pushed against it, it resisted, as if held shut by invisible hands. The panic started as a flutter in my chest, then spread outward like spilled liquid. This wasn't real, couldn't be real. Phone booths didn't appear from nowhere on empty roads. Static didn't whisper instructions. Odometers didn't count backward, but when I looked through the booth's glass panels at my motorcycle, the display clearly showed 47378. I threw my shoulder against the door and it opened so suddenly that I nearly fell the night. Air struck me like a physical blow, sharp and clean. After the stifling warmth of the booth's interior, I stumbled back to my motorcycle, my legs unsteady beneath me. The odometer read 47,397. I watched the display intently, my eyes fixed on the glowing numbers. Nothing happened. The digits remained constant, solid, reassuring. But the moment I glanced away, just a quick look around to check my surroundings and looked back, another mile had vanished, 47,376. The pattern became clear with horrible certainty each time I observed the odometer directly. It remained stable, but whenever my attention wandered, even for a second, the count decreased. It was as if my very act of observation was the only thing preventing some inexorable process from continuing. The static from the phone booth grew louder, more insistent. Even with the door closed and the handset cradled, I could hear it clearly. The sound had evolved beyond simple electronic noise into something that seemed almost organic, like the whispered conversations of insects or the rustle of dry leaves. Within the static I began to hear other sounds, distant traffic, the slam of car doors, voices calling across empty spaces. 47,375. I tried starting the motorcycle. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, producing only a sick whining sound that echoed strangely in the surrounding darkness. The headlight flickered, dimmed, then brightened again, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The static spoke again clearer. Now the words formed like ice crystals in my mind, sharp and impossibly cold. How far have you really traveled? I stared at the odometer, refusing to look away. The numbers held steady at 47375, but I could feel them wanting to change, could sense some fundamental force pressing against the barrier of my observation. My eyes began to water from the strain of focusing on the glowing display, but I didn't dare blink. A new sound emerged from the static footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the phone booth in measured intervals. I couldn't see anyone in the darkness beyond my headlight, but the footsteps were unmistakable, the crisp click of dress shoes on pavement, moving with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. My eyes burned. Tears blurred my vision, making the odometer digits swim and shift. I blinked involuntarily just once, and when my vision cleared, the display read 47th hour 374. The footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, I became aware of other sounds that shouldn't have been there. The distant hum of traffic on a road that should have been empty, the electronic chimes of a convenience store door, the murmur of voices discussing weather and groceries and mundane concerns of daily life. It was as if I were hearing echoes of every journey this stretch of road had ever witnessed, all playing simultaneously in the static fill air 47,373. The numbers were falling faster, now dropping. Each time my concentration wavered even slightly, I began to understand that this wasn't about the motorcycle at all. The odometer was measuring something else entirely, some distance I had traveled. That had nothing to do with physical movement through space. The phone booth rang again. The sound cut through the static like a blade, sharp and demanding. I found myself walking toward it before I'd consciously decided to move my legs, carrying me forward with a will of their own. The handset felt heavier, this time as if it were made of lead rather than plastic. The voice that emerged from the static was clearer. Now, though, still distorted. How many miles until you reach where you started? I wanted to ask what that meant, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, constricted, as if something were wrapped around my neck. I could only listen as the voice continued, each word forming with crystalline clarity in the electronic snow. Every journey ends where it began. Every mile forward is a mile back. Count carefully, you're almost home. The odometer read 47,270. When I looked, time seemed to stretch and compress around me. Minutes passed like hours, or perhaps hours passed like minutes. The static became a constant presence, no longer emerging from the phone, but surrounding me entirely, pressing against my skin like warm water. Within its embrace, I heard fragments of conversations. I thought I recognized my own voice, years younger, talking to friends who no longer answered my calls, discussing plans that had never materialized, promises that had never been kept. 47,365. The realization came slowly, like a tide creeping up a beach. The odometer wasn't malfunctioning. It was working exactly as designed, measuring distance with perfect accuracy. But the distance it measured wasn't the physical miles had traveled. It was something else, something that moved in the opposite direction from normal progress. A countdown rather than a tally, a subtraction rather than an addition. I thought about my life over the past few months, the changes I'd made, the routes I'd taken. The motorcycle had been an impulse purchase, bought with money I couldn't afford from a dealer who'd seemed too eager to sell. I'd started taking long rides at night, always ending up on roads I didn't remember choosing, always returning home later than I'd planned, with gaps in my memory that I'd attributed to fatigue. 47mm 360. The footsteps resumed, circling closer. Now I could hear them clearly, despite seeing nothing in the darkness beyond my diminishing headlight. The beam grew weaker with each pulse of my heart, as if my very life force were powering the failing bulb. In the growing shadows, shapes began to emerge. Not quite human, not quite anything else, moving with the fluid grace of smoke. Given form, the phone booth glowed brighter, its red paint now seeming to pulse with an inner light. Through its glass panels, I could see movement inside, figures hunched over what might have been a desk or control panel, their features obscured by the static that now filled the air like fog. 47305. I understood then what the voice had meant. Every mile I'd traveled on my motorcycle had been borrowed, taken from some account that was now demanding payment. The odometer was counting down to zero, measuring not how far I'd gone but how far I had left to go before reaching the place where all journeys end. The static voice spoke one final time, its words echoing in my bones. Welcome home. I looked at the odometer. The numbers flickered, wavered, then settled on a reading that made my heart stop. Euro 000. The headlight died. The engine went silent. In the absolute darkness that followed, I heard the phone booth door open and close, with a sound like a coffin lid settling into place. Footsteps approached across the gravel, slow and inevitable. But when morning came, if morning ever came, would anyone find a motorcycle on Clinton Road? Would there be any evidence that I had ever been there at all? Or would the road simply stretch empty between its dark borders, waiting for the next traveler to discover that some distances can only be measured in reverse and some journeys end before they begin? The static whispers that I'm still there, still listening to the phone that rings in an empty booth on an empty road. It whispers that the odometer still glows in the darkness, still counting backward towards zero, still measuring miles that exist only in the space between what was and what might have been. Sometimes, late at night, when the signal is weak and the line is full of electronic snow, people claim they can hear voices in their phones, travelers calling for help from a place that exists just off the main roads, where phone booths appear without explanation and time moves in directions that shouldn't be possible. They say if you listen carefully to the static, you can hear someone reading numbers that decrease instead of increase, counting down to a destination that everyone reaches eventually but no one remembers arriving at. They say the voice sounds desperate, pleading, as if knowing that when the count reaches zero, something fundamental will change, not just for the traveler but for everyone who hears the message. But maybe that's just another story. People tell themselves to make sense of signals that carry no meaning, voices that speak no words and miles that measure nothing more than the distance between where we are and where we fear we're going. The only way to know for sure would be to take that ride yourself, to follow Clinton Road deep into the hours when logical explanations break down and impossible things become inevitable, to listen for the ringing of a phone that shouldn't exist and answer when it calls your name. Just remember to check your odometer before you go and watch it carefully while you're there, because once the numbers start moving backward, you might discover that some trips can't be retraced and some miles can never be recovered. The phone is still ringing somewhere in the static between stations. The booth is still glowing red in the darkness, beside roads that don't appear on any map, and the odometer is still counting down, measuring the distance between where we think we're going and where we've already been. Story 9. The fog rolled in from the northwest that October evening, thick as cotton batting and twice as suffocating. I should have stayed inside, should have drawn the curtains and pretended the world beyond. My property line didn't exist. But the cattle had been restless for 3 days straight, lowing and stamping in ways that made my skin crawl, and I needed to check the fence line before dark. My boots squelched through the damp grass as I made my way across the pasture. Flashlight beam cutting a weak path through the mist. The familiar weight of the mag light in my palm should have been comforting, but tonight it felt inadequate. A child's toy against something vast and patient. That's when I saw it, 9 foot tall, maybe more, standing motionless in the center of the field, like a pale monument to something I couldn't name. Its skin, if skin was the right word, gleamed alabaster white through the fog, smooth and translucent as polished marble. The head swayed slowly from side to side, oval-shaped and too large for any earthly proportion, as if it were calculating something in the air itself, wind patterns maybe, or my approach. I froze, breath catching in my throat. The flashlight beam trembled in my grip, casting wild shadows that seemed to dance around the creature's impossible form. For a heartbeat we regarded each other across 30 yards of mist, shrouded grass, predator and prey, though I couldn't tell which was which. Then my light found its face. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just a smooth expanse of that translucent skin stretched over what might have been bone or might have been something else entirely. Yet I felt its attention like a physical weight pressing against my chest until each breath became a conscious effort. The thing tilted its head and I heard myself make a sound, half gasp, half whimper. Without thinking, I raised the flashlight higher, flooding it with the full force of the beam. It moved. The transformation happened so quickly my eyes could barely process it. One moment it stood upright, alien and statuesque, the next it had folded in on itself with fluid precision, joints bending in directions that defied anatomy. 4 limbs, no, 4 claws, touched the ground simultaneously, each one ending in what looked like curved talons that gleamed wetly in the light. Then it was gone, not running, not leaping. Gone. Vanished into the fog as if it had never existed at all, leaving only silence and the metallic taste of fear coating my tongue. I swept the beam frantically across the empty field, heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. Nothing, no movement, no sound, no sign that anything had ever been there. But when I finally worked up the courage to approach the spot where it had stood, I found them 4 parallel grooves carved deep into the earth, each one perfectly straight and roughly 2 feet long. They looked like scythe marks, as if something impossibly sharp had sliced through the grass and soil. With surgical precision, I ran, then flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I stumbled back toward the house. My lungs burned by the time I reached the porch, and my hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. Once inside, I threw the deadbolt, checked every window and pulled the curtains tight. Sleep didn't come. That night, I sat in my recliner with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, staring at the drawn curtains and listening to every creak the old house made. As it settled around 3 o'clock in the morning, I thought I heard something moving across the front porch, a soft measured tread that might have been footsteps or claws. The sound stopped directly outside my living room window. I held my breath, coffee cup forgotten in my lap, and waited. Minutes crawled by. Then, so faintly I might have imagined it, came the sound of something scraping against the glass, not claws, this time something smoother, like bone or polished stone dragging across the surface in slow, deliberate patterns. When morning finally arrived, I found 4 deep scratches etched into the window pane. Too precise to be accidental and too regular to be natural. They formed a perfect square, as if something had been measuring the glass or marking it. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through 43 years of life without losing my grip on reality, whispered explanations, stress, isolation, too many years living alone on 30 acres with nothing but cattle for company. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, projected my anxieties onto fog and shadows until they took on a life of their own. But the scratches were real, the grooves in the pasture were real, and when I checked the security camera I'd installed above the front door, the timestamp showed exactly what I'd feared: nothing. 4 hours of empty porch mist swirling in the motion sensor light, not so much as a leaf disturbing the stillness. Yet the scratches remained. I spent the next day in town wandering the aisles of Henderson's hardware like a man shopping for his own salvation. Motion lights, security cameras, even a couple of those electronic pest deterrents that were supposed to emit high-frequency sounds. The kid behind the counter, Tommy Henderson's boy, couldn't have been more than 20, looked at me like I'd lost my mind when I asked about reinforcing window glass. "You having trouble with vandals, Mr. Carver?" he asked, scanning the barcodes on a package of outdoor floodlights. I opened my mouth to explain, then thought better of it. How do you tell someone about a 9-foot alabaster creature that folds itself into claws and vanishes without a trace? How do you describe the weight of invisible attention pressing against your chest, or the sound of something inhuman scraping patterns into your windows? Something like that, I muttered, paying in cash and avoiding his eyes. That evening I installed the new equipment with methodical precision, motion sensors on every corner of the house, cameras covering all approaches, lights bright enough to turn midnight into noon at the flip of a switch. If something came back, I'd be ready. The fog rolled in again just after sunset. I watched it approach from my kitchen window, a wall of grey-white vapor that seemed to swallow the landscape whole. The new security lights flickered on and off as wisps of mist triggered the motion sensors, casting the yard in a stuttering strobe that made my eyes water. Around 9 o'clock, the cattle started lowing again. Low, mournful sounds that carried across the field like a funeral dirge. I checked the monitor for the pasture camera, but the fog was too thick to see more than a few feet in any direction. Then the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, so complete it felt solid, pressing in from all sides like a living thing. Emergency lighting kicked in after a few seconds, pale lead strips that cast everything in sickly green shadows, but the security system was down, the cameras blind, the motion sensors useless. I fumbled for my flashlight, hands trembling as I clicked it on. The beam seemed weaker than before, barely penetrating the gloom that had settled over everything like a burial shroud. Through the kitchen window I could see nothing but fog and the faint outline of the nearest fence post. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping against the back door, not knocking. Tapping deliberate and rhythmic, like Morse code or a woodpecker working dead timber. I approached the door slowly, flashlight raised, and peered through the small glass panel set into the frame. Nothing but fog and darkness. The tapping stopped. I stood there for what felt like hours, beam trained on the empty porch, waiting for movement that never came. My back HDHD from the tension and my arms felt like lead weights, but I didn't dare lower the light or step away from the door. When the tapping resumed, it came from the front of the house. I moved through the darkened rooms like a man underwater, each step deliberate and careful. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, sounds I'd never noticed during the day, but which now seemed loud as gunshots in the oppressive silence. The front door's security light was dead, its lead panel dark and lifeless. Through the window beside it, I could make out the vague shape of the porch railing and nothing else. The tapping had stopped again, leaving only the whisper of my own breathing and the distant sound of the cattle growing more agitated. I pressed my face to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the reflection of my flashlight beam. For a moment I saw nothing but swirling mist. Then something moved in my peripheral vision, a pale shape gliding past the edge of the porch with fluid, silent grace. My heart stopped. The thing was back, but different now. Instead of the upright swaying figure I'd seen in the pasture, this creature moved on all fours with predatory elegance. Its limbs were longer than they should have been, joints bending at impossible angles as it navigated the porch, like water flowing around obstacles. I watched in horrified fascination as it approached the window where I stood up close. Its skin was even more translucent than I'd remembered, revealing shadows of structure beneath, not bones exactly, but something harder and more angular, like crystalline formations growing inside a cocoon of pale flesh. It stopped directly in front of the glass, less than 2 feet from my face. For a long moment, we regarded each other in perfect stillness. I could see my own reflection superimposed over its featureless head, my eyes wild and white, with terror. Then, slowly, deliberately, it raised one claw and placed it against the window. The glass didn't break. Instead it began to change, becoming softer, somehow more pliable. The creature's talons sank into the surface like it was pressing into warm clay, leaving a depression that glowed faintly in the darkness. I stumbled backward, flashlight beam wavering wildly, but I couldn't look away. The thing began to move its claw in careful patterns, carving symbols into the glass with surgical precision, not random scratches, this time deliberate marks that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. When it finished, it tilted its head toward me in what might have been acknowledgement or invitation. Then it withdrew its claw, the glass snapping back to its original hardness with an audible pop, leaving the glowing symbols embedded in its surface like veins of luminescent ore. The creature took a step back, folded itself into that impossible four-limbed configuration and vanished into the fog. I don't know how long. I stood there staring at the symbols carved into my window. The pattern seemed familiar, somehow, though I couldn't place where I might have seen them before. They reminded me of circuit diagrams or star charts, or maybe the neural pathways of some vast alien mind. The power came back on around midnight, flooding the house with warm yellow light that should have been comforting but instead felt harsh and artificial after hours of darkness. I checked every camera, reviewed every sensor log, searched through 4 hours of recorded footage. Nothing as far as the security system was concerned. I'd spent the evening alone talking to shadows and carving patterns into my own windows, but the symbols remained glowing faintly in the restored porch light like radioactive tattoos etched into the glass, and when I looked closer I realized they weren't just carved into the surface. They went all the way through, visible from both sides, as if something had reached into the very molecular structure of the material and rearranged it at will. I called in sick the next morning and drove to the county library desperate for answers. I wasn't sure I wanted to find. Mrs. Peterson, the librarian who'd known me since I was 12, looked concerned when I asked about local folklore and unexplained phenomena. She directed me to a dusty section in the basement where old newspapers and historical documents were stored in banker boxes that smelled of mildew and forgotten time. I spent 6 hours down there searching through decades of local records for any mention of strange sightings or unexplained events. Most of what I found was typical small-town oddity reports of phantom lights over the old quarry, cattle mutilations that turned out to be coyote attacks, the usual collection of ghost stories that accumulate around any place with enough history. But in a 1987 issue of the County Gazette, buried in a section of reader-submitted stories, I found something that made my blood run cold. A farmer named Ezekiel Morrison had written about encounters with what he called the Pale Watcher, a creature that appeared during fog, heavy nights, and seemed to study his property with inhuman intelligence. Morrison's description matched what I'd seen almost perfectly: 9-foot-tall alabaster skin, an oval head that swayed as if calculating wind patterns. But his account went further, describing weeks of escalating encounters that left him questioning his own sanity. Strange marks on his windows, geometric patterns carved into his fields, the sense of being perpetually observed by something that existed just beyond the edge of perception. The final entry was dated 3 weeks later, a brief obituary stating that Ezekiel Morrison had been found dead in his kitchen, apparently of natural causes. No mention of foul play, no signs of struggle, just a man who died alone, surrounded by windows covered in symbols that local authorities couldn't explain and didn't care to investigate. I photocopied every page, hands shaking as the machine hummed and flashed. On the drive home I couldn't stop thinking about Morrison's fate, not the death itself, but the isolation that had preceded it, the slow dissolution of certainty, the gradual erosion of the boundary between real and imagined, until nothing remained but questions without answers and a man alone with his fear. The fog has been rolling in every night for 2 weeks now. The creature appears without fail, always after the power goes out, always when my security system conveniently malfunctions. Each visit adds new symbols to my windows. And each morning I find fresh grooves carved into the earth around my house, complex geometric patterns that seem to form some kind of expanding diagram. I've stopped trying to photograph the marks or document the encounters. The evidence always disappears or corrupts, leaving me with nothing but my own increasingly unreliable testimony. Friends and neighbors have begun to avoid me, their expressions carefully neutral when I try to explain what's happening. Dr. Martinez, the physician I've been seeing since childhood, has started using terms like stress-induced hallucinations and isolated psychotic episodes. Maybe he's right. Maybe the rational explanations are the only ones that matter and everything else is just the product of a mind under pressure, finding patterns in chaos and meaning in randomness. Maybe Ezekiel Morrison died of natural causes and the symbols on his windows were just the delusions of a lonely man who spent too much time staring into the fog. But tonight, as I write this, the mist is gathering again beyond my window. The power will go out soon, it always does, and the pale watcher will return to continue whatever work it believes itself to be doing. The symbols on my glass have begun to pulse more rapidly, their glow intensifying as darkness falls, and I can feel that familiar weight of attention settling over the house like a blanket made of eyes. I don't know what it wants from me, this alabaster sentinel that folds itself into impossible configurations and carves meaning into matter with surgical precision. I don't know if it's real or imagined, alien or terrestrial, harbinger or phantom. All I know is that Morrison's story ended with his death, and mine shows no sign of reaching any conclusion at all. The fog is thicker tonight than it's ever been, pressing against the windows like living tissue. The cattle have fallen silent. Not the restless quiet of earlier weeks, but a deeper stillness that suggests they've finally learned to accept what they cannot understand. I think I'm beginning to understand as well, not what the creature is or what it wants, but something more fundamental about the nature of certainty itself. We build our lives on the assumption that reality is fixed, that the world operates according to rules we can comprehend and categories we can define. But what happens when those assumptions prove inadequate? What do we become when the boundaries of the possible expand beyond our ability to map them? The lights just flickered. Soon the house will be plunged into that familiar green-tinted darkness, and I'll take my position at the window to watch symbols being carved into glass by something that may or may not exist. Tomorrow I'll examine the evidence in daylight and find nothing that can't be explained away by stress, isolation, and the persistent human need to find meaning in meaninglessness. But right now, in this moment between certainty and doubt, I can hear the soft tapping beginning at my back door, patient, rhythmic, and somehow approving, as if the pale watcher has finally taught me the most important lesson of all. Some questions aren't meant to be answered, they're meant to be lived with. The power is going out. Now the tapping has stopped, which means it's moving to the front of the house, where new symbols wait to be carved and new understanding waits to be born. I'm no longer afraid. I think that's what worries me most of all. Story 10. The GPS died somewhere between mile marker 17 and the place where hope goes to rot. Static had been crawling through the radio for the last hour, punctuated by brief garbled voices speaking in what might have been Spanish, or perhaps just the sound of wind through broken teeth. My phone showed no signal. Naturally, 3 bars would have been a miracle out here in what the locals probably called God's country, though God seemed to have abandoned this particular stretch of Nebraska dirt road. Sometime around the Dust Bowl, the headlights carved twin tunnels through darkness, so complete it felt solid, pressing against the windshield like black velvet dust motes danced in the beams, tiny ghosts performing their eternal waltz. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, chasing a job interview that had seemed crucial 12 hours ago, and now felt like someone else's half-remembered dream. The interstate had led to state highways which had led to county roads, which had somehow deposited me onto this nameless artery of packed earth and gravel that stretched endlessly into the Nebraska void. My hands HDHD from gripping the steering wheel. The car, a 15-year-old Honda that had seen better decades, groaned with each pothole and rut. The engine temperature gauge hovered dangerously close to the red zone, and I could smell something burning that probably shouldn't be burning, but stopping here in this ocean of corn stubble and winter dead grass felt like surrendering to something I couldn't name. That's when I saw the light ahead, not headlights. I'd been alone on this road for over an hour. This light flickered like flame, warm and yellow, against the crushing darkness. As I drew closer, my foot, unconsciously easing off the accelerator, the light resolved into multiple sources. Lanterns, I realized, old-fashioned kerosene lanterns held aloft by figures standing in what appeared to be a perfect circle in the middle of the road. I brought the car to a stop about 30 yards away, close enough to see, but far enough to feel some illusion of safety. The engine ticked and pinged as it cooled, the only sound in a world that had suddenly gone impossibly quiet. Even the wind had died. There were 9 of them, maybe 10. It was difficult to count with any certainty, because they stood so still. They seemed to blur together, white shapes against the black sky. Each figure wore what looked like a bedsheet draped over their body, the kind of improvised ghost costume children might wear for Halloween. But these sheets were wrong, stained with dark patches that could have been mud or something worse. The fabric hung heavy and wet, clinging to bodies underneath in ways that suggested human form but not quite human proportions. They faced inward, toward the center of their circle, not toward me, though I felt observed. Nonetheless, each figure held a lantern raised above their head, but the lanterns cast no light. They were dark, cold, useless things that somehow managed to be more unsettling than if they had been ablaze. The only illumination came from my headlights, creating a cone of harsh white light that seemed to stop just short of the circle, as if the darkness there was thicker, more resistant. I sat in the car for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, waiting for someone to move, to acknowledge my presence, to do anything that would explain what I was seeing. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through college and 3 job interviews this week, suggested this was some kind of rural art installation, or perhaps a religious ceremony. I didn't understand. Nebraska was full of small communities with their own traditions, their own ways of marking time and season. But the rational part of my mind was being systematically strangled by the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. The figures were too. Still, no human being could stand that motionless for that long, not without some subtle shift of weight, some involuntary movement. Even in deep meditation or prayer, people breathed, and breathing meant movement. These figures stood like statues, like scarecrows, like things that had never drawn breath at all. And there was the matter of the lanterns. Why carry lanterns that provided no light? Why gather in a circle in the middle of a dirt road? I checked the dashboard, clock 2:47 in the morning. The whole scene felt staged, theatrical, as if it existed solely for my benefit. But that was impossible. No one knew I would be on this road tonight. Hell, I didn't know I would be on this road tonight. I realized I was holding my breath and forced myself to exhale. The sound seemed thunderous in the car's small cabin. I considered backing up, turning around, finding another route to wherever I was going. But the road behind me stretched into darkness just as complete as what lay ahead, and I had no guarantee that reversing would lead me anywhere except deeper into this rural maze. Instead, I reached for the headlight switch and flicked it off. Then on again. A universal signal, the equivalent of clearing your throat in the presence of strangers. The brief moment of darkness was like being swallowed, but when the lights came back on, the circle was empty, not gone. empty, as if the figures had simply dissolved into the night air, leaving behind only the faint impression that something had been there moments before the road stretched clear ahead. No obstacles, no mysterious gatherings, nothing but packed earth and the promise of eventually reaching civilization. I sat staring at the empty road for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sensible thing would be to drive forward, to chalk this up to fatigue and highway hypnosis, to the kind of visual tricks that happen when you've been driving too long on too little sleep. I was probably micro-sleeping, experiencing brief dreams that felt completely real. It happened to long-distance drivers all the time. But as I reached for the gear shift, movement in the rearview mirror caught my eye. They were there in the reflection, standing in their circle exactly as they had been moments before, 9 or 10 figures in mud-stained sheets, lanterns raised, facing inward in perfect stillness. I could see them clearly in the mirror, illuminated by my own tail lights which cast everything in hellish red. I spun around in my seat, craning my neck to look through the rear window. The road behind me was empty, just as empty as the road ahead. But when I looked back at the rear view mirror there, they were as clear as if they were standing directly behind my car. My hands shook as I adjusted the mirror, tilting it up and down side to side. The figures remained constant, unmoving, their lanterns dark and their faces hidden beneath white cotton shrouds. I could see details, now that I hadn't noticed before, the way the mud stains formed patterns across the sheets, almost like writing in some language. I didn't recognize the way the figures' posture suggested not just stillness but waiting, as if they were posed in the moment before some significant action. And I could see something else, something that made my mouth go dry and my vision blur. At the edges, one of the figures, the one facing most directly toward my vantage point, had turned its head just slightly, just enough that the shadow cast by the hood of its sheet suggested the profile of a face looking not inward toward the center of the circle but outward toward me. I forced myself to look away from the mirror to focus on the empty road ahead. This was fatigue, nothing more, hallucinations brought on by stress and exhaustion and too much coffee and not enough food. I would drive forward, reach the next town, find a motel and sleep for 10 hours in the morning. This would all seem like the kind of strange dream that dissolves with daylight. But as I put the car in drive and pressed the accelerator, I found my eyes drawn back to the mirror again and again. The figures remained constant, always there in the reflection, never visible. When I turned to look directly, and each time I checked the mirror, it seemed like more of them had turned to face outward to face me. By the time I'd driven a 4 mile, all of them were facing in my direction. The road ahead remained empty, winding through farmland and pasture, past mailboxes and driveways that led to houses. I couldn't see normal things, reassuring things, evidence of ordinary human life going on behind the veil of darkness. But the mirror showed a different story, one where 10 figures in mud-stained sheets followed my car like a strange parade, always maintaining their perfect circle, always staying exactly the same distance behind me, no matter how fast or slow I drove. I tried turning off the headlights entirely, plunging myself into complete darkness. But somehow I could still see the road, as if the surface were faintly luminous, and the figures in the mirror remained visible, now glowing with their own pale light like phosphorescent fungi. I tried speeding up, pushing the old Honda to its limits on the rough road. The speedometer climbed to 60, then 70. The car shuddering and complaining with every bump and rut. But when I checked the mirror, the figures maintained their distance exactly, neither falling behind nor drawing closer, as if they were connected to my car by invisible chains. I tried talking to myself, narrating what I was seeing, in the hope that hearing my own voice would break whatever spell this was. But my voice sounded strange in the car's cabin, hollow and distant, as if it were coming from someone else's throat, and the words I spoke seemed to have no effect on the figures in the mirror, who continued their silent procession with infinite patience. Miles passed, the fuel gauge dropped steadily toward empty. I passed through 2 small towns, or what might have been towns, collections of darkened buildings and empty streets that could have been abandoned for decades. No lights in any windows, no cars parked along the curbs, no signs of human habitation. But the figures in the mirror remained constant, always there, always watching. It was only when I reached what must have been the county line marked by a sign, so weathered I couldn't read it, that I realized something had changed. The figure that had first turned to face me, the one who seemed to be the leader of this strange procession, had moved, not just turned its head but taken a step forward, breaking the perfect geometry of the circle. And as I watched in the mirror, paralyzed by a fear that seemed to originate in some primitive part of my brain, another figure stepped forward, then another. The circle was dissolving its members, beginning to walk not along the road behind me but directly toward my car, passing through the reflection as if the mirror were a doorway rather than a simple piece of silvered glass. I slammed on the brakes, sending the car into a skid that ended with me sideways across the road. The engine stalled. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own ragged breathing and the rapid drum beat of my heart. I turned around in my seat, looking through the rear window with my own eyes rather than trusting the mirror. The road behind me was empty, completely, utterly empty. But when I looked back at the rear-view mirror, one of the figures was standing directly behind my car, close enough that I could see the individual threads in the weave of its muddy sheet. Its face was hidden in the shadow of its hood, but I could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing against the back of my skull. I turned the key. The engine cranked but didn't catch, turned it again. Nothing but the grinding of the starter motor and the smell of something burning under the hood. The figure in the mirror hadn't moved, but somehow it seemed closer, as if the mirror were a telescope that someone was slowly adjusting, bringing a distant object into increasingly sharp focus. On the fourth try, the engine caught. I threw the car into drive and accelerated away from whatever was or wasn't standing behind me, my speedometer climbing past safe speeds for a dirt road in the middle of the night. But I had no choice. The alternative was to sit still and let whatever was happening continue to happen, and every instinct I possessed screamed against that course of action. The mirror showed empty road. Now, no figures visible, but I could feel them somehow like pressure in my inner ear, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air becomes thick and electric. They were still there, still following just outside the range of reflection. I drove for another hour, maybe 2 times, becoming elastic and unreliable. The fuel gauge showed empty, but the engine kept running. The road surface improved, gradually, dirt, giving way to gravel, then to cracked asphalt. I began to see signs of civilization, power lines, fence posts, the occasional mailbox, normal things, real things. By the time I reached an actual paved highway, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. Dawn was still hours away, but the absolute darkness of the rural night was giving way to the merely dim grayness that precedes morning. I pulled into the parking lot of a truck stop, its neon signs promising coffee and bathrooms and human contact. I sat in the car for a long time before getting out, staring at the rear-view mirror. It showed exactly what it should show, the empty parking lot behind me. A few 18-wheelers, the kind of ordinary scene you'd expect to find at any truck stop anywhere in America. No figures and sheets, no dark lanterns, no circles of watchers. But as I finally opened the car door and stepped out into the cool pre-dawn air, I caught sight of my reflection in the car's side window. And for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, the reflection seemed wrong, not my face looking out, but something else looking in, something wearing a mud-stained sheet and carrying a dark lantern. I blinked and my own familiar features looked back at me from the glass. Tired eyes, stubble, the face of a man who'd been driving too long and sleeping too little. Perfectly normal, perfectly real. But as I walked toward the truck stop, I found myself avoiding every reflective surface. I passed the windows of parked cars, the polished chrome of bumpers, even puddles of water left by an earlier rain, because sometimes in the corner of my vision I thought I could see movement in those reflections, figures gathering, lanterns being raised, and sometimes late at night, when I'm driving alone, I still check the rear-view mirror not to see what's behind me on the road but to see what might be behind me in the reflection, because I've learned that those are two very different things. And the difference matters in ways. I'm only beginning to understand the job interview I'd been driving to when all this started. I never made it, called the next morning to explain. I'd been delayed by car trouble, which was true enough. They were understanding, said we could reschedule, but I never did. Some opportunities, I've learned, aren't worth the roads you have to travel to reach them. These days I stick to main highways, interstate routes with plenty of traffic and good lighting. I've learned to read maps the old-fashioned way, with paper and pencil, so I never have to rely on GPS systems that might malfunction at crucial moments. And I always travel during daylight hours. But sometimes when I'm stopped at a red light or waiting in a drive-through line, I catch sight of something in my mirrors, a flicker of movement, a suggestion of white fabric, the faint impression of lanterns being raised in greeting or warning. And I remember that circle of figures on that unnamed road, standing in the darkness, with their dark lanterns and their patient, eternal watching. I remember how they dissolved when my headlights found them, and how they reappeared in reflections, and how they began to walk toward me through glass that should have been nothing more than glass. I don't know if they were real. I don't know if I was awake or dreaming, if what I experienced was supernatural or psychological, if those figures were something external to me or something my mind created to cope with exhaustion and isolation and the peculiar madness that can overtake anyone who drives too far into the American night. But I know this: every mirror is a doorway and every reflection is a choice. And sometimes, if you look too long or too carefully, you might see something looking back that isn't quite you, isn't quite real, but isn't quite gone either. The figures in the mud-stained sheets are still out there, I think, still standing in their perfect circle. Still raising their dark lanterns, still waiting for the next lost traveler to find them on some nameless road in the heart of nowhere, still ready to follow, to watch, to step through the glass when the moment is right, and sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn. I wonder if they're waiting for me to come back. Story 11. The rusted gate gave way with a screech that seemed to echo through my bones. I shouldn't have been there, trespassing on private property in the Irish countryside, chasing ghost stories and folklore, like some amateur paranormal investigator. But the local pub talk had been too tantalizing. Stories of Blackmore Castle burned to its foundations 3 centuries ago, where time itself had supposedly gone wrong. The path through the overgrown brambles led me deeper into what had once been manicured grounds. Skeletal tree branches clawed at my jacket as I pushed forward the late afternoon, mist rolling in from the hills like searching fingers. The smell hit me first, not the earthy dampness I'd expected, but something sharper, something that made my nostrils burn and my throat close up. Charcoal, fresh charcoal, as if someone had just extinguished a massive fire. When the ruins finally emerged from the fog, my breath caught. The guidebooks hadn't done justice to the sheer scale of destruction. What remained of Blackmore Castle stood like broken teeth against the darkening sky, blackened stone walls jutting up at impossible angles. Their surfaces so thoroughly charred they seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the clouds. The central tower, somehow more intact than the rest, rose above the wreckage like an accusatory finger. But it was wrong. All of it. The char marks were too crisp, too defined. Stone didn't burn like wood, didn't leave these perfect carbon impressions that looked fresh enough to smudge if I touched them. I'd researched the fire extensively. It had happened in 1724, nearly 300 years ago. Weather and time should have softened. These edges should have worn away the evidence of that terrible night. I picked my way through the debris field that had once been the Great Hall, my boots crunching on what I hoped was only gravel. The sound echoed strangely in the enclosed space, bouncing off the standing walls with a peculiar reverb that made each footstep sound like 2 then 3, as if someone else was walking just behind me. Matching my pace, I spun around nothing but empty ruins and thickening mist. The feeling of being watched settled over me like a damp cloak. Not the casual observation of curious wildlife or distant hikers, but something focused and intentional, something that knew I was there and was taking careful measure of my presence. The sensation raised goosebumps along my arms and made the back of my neck prickle with electric awareness. I told myself it was just nerves. Old ruins had that effect on people. All that history and tragedy soaked into the stones. But as I continued deeper into the castle's remains, the feeling only intensified. Every shadow seemed to shift. When I wasn't looking directly at it, every sound carried undertones I couldn't quite identify. The tower's interior surprised me. While the outer walls bore the same carbonized scarring as the rest of the castle, the spiral staircase inside remained largely intact. The steps were worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic, but structurally sound. Something about their condition bothered me, though I couldn't put my finger on what they looked recently used. Against my better judgment, I began to climb the staircase wound upward through increasingly oppressive darkness. My phone's flashlight beam seemed inadequate, barely penetrating the shadows that pressed in from all sides. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with that persistent charcoal smell and something else, something organic and unpleasant that reminded me of wet ashes after a campfire. Halfway up I noticed the temperature change. It was subtle. At first just a gradual warmth that felt welcome after the damp chill outside, but as I climbed higher, the warmth became heat, then uncomfortable heat. By the time I reached what I guessed was the 3rd level, sweat was beating on my forehead. Despite the cool October air, the feeling of being watched had evolved into something more active. I could sense movement in my peripheral vision, quick darting motions that vanished when I turned to look. My rational mind insisted it was just tricks of light and shadow, but my instincts were screaming at me to turn around and leave. The primitive part of my brain that had kept my ancestors alive was sending clear signals. Predator nearby, danger, run. I kept climbing anyway. The tower room at the top was a revelation. Unlike the rest of the castle, this space showed no signs of fire damage. The stone walls were clean, grey granite unmarked by flame or smoke. Tall, narrow windows looked out over the surrounding countryside, their glass intact and surprisingly clear. But it was the room's sole occupant that stopped me cold. A grandfather clock stood against the far wall, its dark wood case, gleaming as if it had been polished yesterday. The pendulum hung motionless behind a glass panel and the clock face showed 12 midnight, exactly, both hands pointing straight up in perfect vertical alignment. Everything about it was wrong. Clocks didn't survive castle fires, wood didn't remain uncharred when everything around it had been reduced to carbon and, most importantly, no one maintained antique timepieces in abandoned ruins. I approached it slowly. That predatory awareness prickling stronger than ever. The craftsmanship was exquisite, hand-carved details in the wood case, brass fittings that gleamed with care and a face of white porcelain marked with elegant Roman numerals. But there was something off about the proportions, something that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on the details too closely. The minute hand was pointing in the wrong direction. Not wrong in the sense that it indicated the incorrect time, but wrong in its fundamental orientation. It pointed counterclockwise from the 12, as if the clock measured time in reverse. The hour hand maintained its traditional position, but the minute hand had been mounted backward, creating a visual discord that made my brain itch. Common sense told me to leave it alone. Every survival instinct I possessed was firing simultaneously, flooding my system with adrenaline and the urgent need to escape. But curiosity, that fatal human flaw, overrode my better judgment. I reached for the small winding key that hung from a chain on the clock's side. The metal was warm against my fingers, warmer than it should have been in the cool tower room. As I inserted the key into the winding mechanism and began to turn it, I heard the first sound the castle had made since my arrival, a low, resonant humming that seemed to come from the stones themselves. 1 full turn, 2, 3. On the 4th turn the clock came to life. The pendulum began its measured swing, but wrong, so fundamentally wrong that watching it made me nauseous. Instead of the steady tick-tock rhythm I expected, it moved with a sound like cake cut, each swing seeming to pull time backward rather than push it forward. The minute hand began to move, but counterclockwise, unwinding the minutes as if time itself was being reversed. And the smell hit me like a physical blow, fresh charcoal. Not the stale weathered scent that had lingered around the ruins, but the sharp acrid smell of wood and stone burning. Right now. My eyes began to water from the smoke that wasn't there and my throat constricted against fumes. I couldn't see the temperature in the room spiked. It was as if someone had opened an oven door directly in front of me. Sweat immediately soaked through my shirt and the air became difficult to breathe. But there was no fire, no flames, no visible source for the heat that was rapidly making the room unbearable. Through the windows, I could see the ruins below beginning to glow, not with electric lights or campfires, but with the deep red glow of banked coals. The blackened stones were heating up, radiating warmth that rose in shimmering waves. The char marks on the walls pulsed like dying embers being coaxed back to life. And underneath it, all that backwards clock continued its relentless kutkit, each swing, pulling the present moment deeper into some incomprehensible past. I reached for the pendulum, desperate to stop the mechanism before whatever was happening could progress further. But the moment my fingers made contact with the brass weight, the room exploded into chaos. Heat like the interior of a furnace slammed into me from all sides. The charcoal smell became overwhelming, mixing with the scent of burning wool and scorched leather. Through the windows, I could see the ruins below blazing with invisible fire, stone walls, glowing cherry, red timber that had burned away centuries ago, somehow combusting again in phantom flames. But it was the sounds that nearly broke my sanity. Voices, hundreds of voices screaming in harmonies of terror and agony, not coming from outside the tower but from within the walls themselves, as if the stones had absorbed every cry of fear and pain from that long-ago night and were now playing them back in reverse. The screams were overlaid with other sounds, the crackle of flames, the crash of falling timbers, the desperate pounding of fists against doors that would never open again. All of it backward, all of it wrong. I yanked my hand away from the pendulum and the sounds cut off like someone had thrown a switch. The heat dissipated instantly, leaving me gasping in air that was suddenly too cool, too thin. The glow from the ruins below faded back to the dull grey of weathered stone, but the clock kept running. Cut it, each swing taking us further from now and deeper into. Then my hands shook as I reached for the pendulum, again, this time grabbing it firmly and holding it still. The mechanism fought me for a moment, the brass weight vibrating in my grip as if it wanted to continue its impossible movement. Then it stopped. Silence returned to the tower room, normal silence, without the underlying harmonic screams or the sound of stones remembering fire. The temperature stabilized. The charcoal smell faded to the background level that had followed me throughout the ruins. But something had changed. I could feel it in the air itself, a wrongness that went deeper than temperature or smell. The very quality of the space around me had shifted, become somehow less real. Colors seemed slightly off, as if I was viewing everything through tinted glass. Shadows fell at angles that didn't match the position of the windows, and underneath it all was the growing certainty that I was no longer alone in the tower. The feeling of being watched had evolved into something more immediate, something that wasn't content to observe. From a distance, I could sense movement behind me, careful and deliberate, as if someone was trying very hard not to be noticed. Every hair on my body stood on end as I slowly turned around. The room was empty, but the air near the doorway shimmered like heat waves. And I could see footprints in the dust, fresh footprints that led from the staircase to where I stood and then continued past me toward the windows, footprints that matched my boots exactly. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at the impossible tracks. They were perfect copies of my own treads, but they told a story. I hadn't lived according to the dust patterns. I had already been in this room multiple times. I had walked this same circuit between clock and windows dozens of times, wearing the same boots, leaving the same impressions, but I had never been here before. Today, the logical explanations crumbled one by one. These weren't old tracks. The dust was too fine, too distributed. They weren't someone else's boots. The tread pattern was too specific, including a distinctive wear mark on the left heel where I habitually dragged my foot slightly. And they weren't some kind of optical illusion. I could see where my current footprints intersected and overlaid the existing ones. I was looking at evidence of multiple visits I had never made. The clock face swam in my vision as I turned back to it, the Roman numerals blurring and resharpening in patterns that hurt to follow. Both hands still pointed to midnight. But now I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. The glass over the clock face was slightly fogged, as if someone had been breathing on it from the inside. From the inside. I leaned closer, my own breath adding to the condensation, and saw something that stopped my heart entirely. Scratch marks, tiny, desperate scratch marks on the inner surface of the glass, as if something had been trapped inside the clock face and was trying to claw its way out. The marks were recent. They cut through the fog with sharp precision, forming patterns that looked almost like letters, like someone or something was trying to communicate. Help was carved into the condensation, barely visible, but unmistakably. There below it, in smaller scratches can't stop the burning, and at the bottom in letters so tiny, I had to press my face against the glass to read them. It's not real, but it never ends. My reflection stared back at me from the clock face, multiplied and distorted by the layers of glass and fog. But it was wrong. The reflection showed me, as I was now sweating, terrified, my hair disheveled from the climb up the tower, but it also showed me as I might be would be had been other versions of myself layered behind the primary reflection, like double-exposed photographs. Some looked older, some younger. Some bore expressions of confusion that matched my current state, others showed abject terror that far exceeded what I was feeling, and one, barely visible in the deepest layer of reflections, was screaming silently behind the glass. All of them were me. All of them were trapped in the clock face, scratching their desperate messages on glass that separated them from a reality they could see but never touch. I stumbled backward my heel, catching on something that shouldn't have been there. Looking down, I saw a winding key identical to the one hanging from the clock, except this one was lying on the floor, covered in dust and showing signs of long use. The metal was tarnished, the chain broken. Then I noticed another key and another. The floor around the clock was littered with winding keys in various stages of decay. Some looked centuries old, their metal green with verdigris. Others appeared more recent, their brass still holding hints of shine. All of them were positioned as if they had been dropped by someone standing exactly where I was standing now, someone who had made the same discovery I was making, someone who had wound the same clock, someone who had stopped the same pendulum, someone who had read the same desperate messages scratched into the inner glass. The pattern was clear and terrifying. This had happened before many times, before each key represented another visitor who had found their way to this tower room, who had encountered this impossible clock, who had made the same choices I was making. But where were they now? The question formed in my mind just as the answer became apparent. They were still here, still in the room with me, but displaced in time by the clock's backward mechanism. The footprints in the dust weren't evidence of previous visits. They were evidence of simultaneous visits occurring in different temporal layers. Every turn of that key had wound time backward. Every stop of the pendulum had created a temporal scar. The tower room had become a collection point for moments that refused to move forward, a place where past and present existed in overlapping layers that occasionally bled through to create impossible evidence of what had been and what would be. I was not the first to discover this place, I would not be the last. And somewhere in the layered reflections of that clock face, I could see my own future trapped behind glass, scratching warning messages that no one would heed, watching helplessly as new versions of myself repeated the same sequence of discoveries and choices that had led to this moment. The clock's hands pointed to midnight. But midnight of when? Which midnight? How many midnights had accumulated in this room, stacked like cards in a deck that could never be shuffled? The temperature began to rise again, and I realized with growing horror that the clock was still running, despite my stopping the pendulum. The backward time mechanism operated on rules I didn't understand, powered by forces that existed outside normal causality. Stopping the visible pendulum hadn't stopped the clock, it had only made its operation invisible. The charcoal smell returned stronger than before, and through the windows I could see the ruins beginning their impossible glow. But this time I understood what I was seeing, not the memory of a fire from centuries past, but the accumulation of all fires, every moment of burning that had ever occurred in this place, compressed into a single, eternal instant of combustion. The stones weren't remembering the fire. They were still burning. They had never stopped burning, and neither, I realized with crystalline clarity, would I. The room around me began to shimmer and shift, reality becoming negotiable as temporal layers pressed against each other. I could see other versions of myself moving through the same space, some arriving for the first time, some leaving in panic, some standing motionless, as they grappled with the same realizations I was experiencing. All of us were real, all of us were here, all of us were now, and all of us were trapped in the backward hours of a clock that measured time in reverse, unwinding our minutes and seconds until past and present became meaningless distinctions. In a tower room where every moment was midnight and the burning never ended, I reached for the winding key hanging from the clock, knowing I would turn it, knowing I would start the sequence again, knowing I would make all the same choices, because those choices had already been made in a time that moved backward toward a beginning. That was also an ending. The key was warm in my fingers. The clock face reflected infinite versions of my terrified expression, and somewhere in the ruins, below, fresh charcoal began to burn with the heat of a fire that had never been extinguished because it had never truly begun. Time moved backward, the burning continued, and I understood, with the terrible clarity of someone whose midnight had become eternal, that I had not discovered this place. This place had discovered me, had been waiting for me, had been calling me here across centuries and timelines and layers of reality, pulling me backward through the hours to this moment. That was every moment. This choice, that was every choice. This ending, that was also a beginning in a clock that wound time in the wrong direction and measured eternity. In the space between tick and talk, Karkutkas sit, the sound echoed in dimensions I couldn't name, and I began to turn the key. Story 12. Said lights carved a narrow tunnel through the Idaho desert. Darkness, two pale beams that seemed to dissolve into nothingness just yards ahead. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, my eyes burning from the strain of staring into that endless black void. The radio had given up on me somewhere past Boise, leaving only the hum of the engine and the whisper of wind against the windows to keep me company. 3 o'clock in the morning, the witching hour my grandmother used to call it, the time when the world grew thin between what was real and what lurked just beyond perception. I'd always dismissed her superstitions, but out here, in this vast emptiness, her words seemed to carry more weight. The coffee had long since worn off, leaving behind a jittery exhaustion that made my hands tremble slightly on the steering wheel. I should have stopped at that last truck stop, should have grabbed a motel room and waited for daylight, but something had driven me forward, an inexplicable urgency that I couldn't name or explain. That's when I saw it, a shape in the road ahead, black against black, visible only because it blocked the stars. I eased off the gas, squinting through the windshield as my headlights gradually illuminated what waited for me, a scarecrow. Standing dead center in the middle of the asphalt, arms spread wide, as if greeting an old friend. But this wasn't some farmer's field guardian. This thing wore a black suit, crisp and formal, like it was dressed for a funeral. The fabric looked expensive, well-tailored, completely at odds with the rough burlap face and the straw that peeked out from the sleeves and collar. A thin black tie hung perfectly straight down its chest, and polished dress shoes reflected my headlights. With an unnatural gleam, I slowed to a crawl, my heart hammering against my ribs. Who the hell puts a scarecrow in the middle of a highway? Some teenagers playing a prank. But there were no farms out here, no houses for miles, just scrub brush and alkali flats stretching to the horizon. I pulled to the left, giving the thing a wide berth. As I passed, I rolled down the window, slightly letting in the cool desert air. That's when it happened. The scarecrow's head turned. Not a gradual rotation, not the slow movement of something caught by the wind. It snapped around like a bird watching prey, tracking my car with mechanical precision. And then, as I drew alongside it, it spoke. Marcus. My name whispered through the gap in my window in a voice like dried leaves scraping against concrete, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carrying impossible knowledge. My foot found the gas pedal. Without conscious thought, the car lurched forward, gravel, pinging against the undercarriage. As I fought to maintain control in the rear-view mirror, I watched the scarecrow shrink to a dot, then disappear entirely into the darkness behind me. My hands shook as I rolled the window back up, sealing myself in the relative safety of the car. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations: hallucination brought on by exhaustion, road hypnosis, a trick of the light and wind that had made the thing seem to move and speak. People didn't put scarecrows in the middle of highways, and scarecrows certainly didn't know your name. But even as I tried to rationalize what I'd experienced, a cold certainty settled in my gut. That thing had been waiting for me, specifically for me. I drove harder than I should have on that empty road, pushing the speedometer past 80, as if distance could somehow protect me from what I'd seen. The desert landscape blurred past, identical mile after mile of nothing. No other cars, no lights, no signs of civilization, just me in the road and the growing conviction that I was no longer alone out here. 20 minutes later I reached for my water bottle in the cup holder and noticed that the glove compartment hung open. I was certain I'd left it closed. I always did out of habit. But there it was, gaping like a black mouth in the dashboard. I reached over to shut it and my fingers brushed against fabric. Pulling over to the shoulder, I turned on the dome light and peered into the compartment. There, folded neatly, where my registration and insurance papers should have been, was a black suit, the same black suit. The fabric felt expensive under my fingertips, smooth and cold, but when I lifted it out the lining was damp, with something that wasn't water. The liquid was clear but viscous, with the consistency of partially melted ice. It dripped from the silk lining onto my lap, soaking through my jeans with a cold that seemed to go deeper than temperature. The stuff had no smell, no taste when I hesitantly touched a drop to my tongue, but it left my mouth feeling numb. I held the suit up to the light, examining every detail. The craftsmanship was flawless, the stitching perfect. There was no label, no maker's mark, nothing to indicate where it had come from, but somehow impossibly, I knew it would fit me perfectly. The thought came unbidden and unwelcome. I should try it on. I shook my head violently, stuffing the suit back into the glove compartment and slamming it shut. The metallic click echoed in the car's interior like a gunshot. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked pale and wilded, like a man coming unglued. Get it together, Marcus. People don't just materialize suits in other people's cars. There had to be an explanation. Someone had been in my car while I was when I'd stopped for gas in Boise, but I'd locked the doors, hadn't I? The memory felt fuzzy, uncertain. I could picture myself at the pump, could remember the attendance board expression, but the details kept slipping away like water through my fingers. Had I gone inside to pay? Had I left the car unlocked? But even if someone had gotten into my car, why leave a suit? And how had they known exactly where to find me? The whole thing raya of impossibility, of something that violated the basic rules of how the world worked. I pulled back onto the road, but my earlier urgency had transformed into something else. Now I drove because staying still felt dangerous, because the darkness outside the car seemed to press against the windows with malevolent intent. Every few minutes I checked the glove compartment still closed, still hiding its impossible contents. The desert began to change as I drove deeper into the night. The scrub brush grew denser, taller, until it formed walls on either side of the road. The asphalt itself seemed to narrow, though I knew that was impossible. Roads didn't change width on their own, but the sensation persisted as if the world was slowly contracting around me. That's when I started seeing the others at first. Just glimpses in my peripheral vision, dark shapes standing among the brush, too far away and too brief to identify. But as the miles passed they grew bolder, closer. More of them, dozens of them, all wearing the same black suits, all perfectly still, all watching me pass with invisible eyes. I forced myself to keep looking straight ahead to ignore the growing army of watchers that lined my route. But their presence was a weight I could feel, a pressure that made my temples throb and my breathing shallow. They wanted something from me, these silent sentinels. They were waiting for something. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They were waiting for me to stop. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to pull over, to get out of the car, to walk among them and take my place in their ranks. The urge was almost overwhelming, a compulsion that seemed to bypass rational thought entirely. My hands began to turn the wheel toward the shoulder. Without my permission, I bit down hard on my tongue, using the pain to anchor myself. In reality, the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth as I wrestled the car back onto the road, but the effort left me shaking, exhausted, in a way that went beyond mere physical fatigue. How long had I been driving? The dashboard clock read 4:17 a.m., but that was impossible. It had been just after 3 when I had encountered the scarecrow, and I couldn't have been driving for more than 45 minutes since then, unless I'd lost time, unless something had happened during those missing minutes that I couldn't remember. The thought terrified me more than the scarecrow, more than the suit, more than the watching figures in the brush. Time was supposed to be reliable, constant. You couldn't just lose pieces of it, like pocket change. But even as I tried to rationalize the discrepancy, I became aware of other inconsistencies. My gas gauge read fuller than it should have, as if I'd stopped for fuel somewhere along the way. There was sand on my shoes, gritty between my toes, though I couldn't remember getting out of the car. And in the cup holder where my water bottle should have been, I found a business card. The card was black with silver lettering, expensive, looking like the suit, but there was no name on it, no company, no contact information, just an address, 1247, Meridian Road, and below that a single word. Midnight. I knew that address. The knowledge came from nowhere, unbidden, and certain Meridian Road. I was supposed to go to Meridian Road. The GPS on my phone showed no signal, but somehow I knew the way, left at the next intersection, then straight for 3 miles, then right onto a dirt track that wouldn't appear on any map. The knowledge felt foreign in my head, like a voice that wasn't quite my own, whispering directions. I should have kept driving straight, should have ignored the compulsion and headed for the nearest town, the nearest human contact. But my hands had already begun turning the wheel, following instructions I'd never received to a destination I'd never chosen. The dirt road was barely wide enough for one car. Rutted and rocky dust billowed up behind me, visible in the red glow of my tail lights on either side. The brush pressed close, scraping against the car's paint, with sounds like fingernails on glass. And still the watchers followed, keeping pace through the desert, their black suits flowing like liquid shadow in the darkness. The road ended at a small clearing where a single building sat under the star-filled sky. It was unremarkable, a low rectangular structure that might have been a warehouse or storage facility. No signs, no identifying marks, no indication of what purpose it might serve out here in the middle of nowhere. But there was light spilling from under the door, warm and yellow, and utterly wrong in this place of isolation. I sat in the car for a long time, engine running, staring at that building. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to leave, to turn around and drive until I found civilization. But I couldn't make myself move. The watchers had emerged from the brush and now stood in a perfect circle around the clearing, silent and patient, and in the glove compartment. I could feel the suit waiting. The compulsion was too strong to resist any longer. I reached over and opened the compartment, pulling out the black suit. The fabric was dry now, but it still carried that bone-deep cold. As I held it up, I realized it wasn't just the right size. It was tailored specifically for me, cut to accommodate the slight stoop in my left shoulder, the extra length I needed in the sleeves. Someone had made this suit for me, had made it and somehow placed it in my car and arranged for me to find it. But who and why? The questions felt less urgent. Now, muffled by a strange calm that had settled over me, I found myself getting out of the car, found myself walking toward the building with the suit draped over my arm. The watchers parted as I approached, creating a path but never quite letting me see their faces. The door opened at my touch, revealing a room lit by dozens of candles. The space was larger than the building's exterior had suggested, stretching away into shadows that seemed to move independent of the flickering flames and waiting. In the center of the room was a mirror, tall, ornate, its silver surface reflecting the candle light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. I knew what I was supposed to do. The knowledge was there in my head, certain and undeniable. I was supposed to put on the suit and look into the mirror and see what my hands shook as I began to undress, folding my clothes neatly on a nearby chair that I was certain hadn't been there moments before. The suit slipped on like a second skin, perfectly fitted, perfectly comfortable. The silk lining was warm, now heated by some internal source that I didn't want to examine too closely. I approached the mirror slowly, each step echoing in the vast space. The candles flickered as I passed, casting my shadow in a dozen different directions, and in the glass I saw myself, but not myself. The reflection showed me wearing the black suit, but my face was wrong, older, harder eyes that held knowledge I didn't possess, experiences I'd never had. And behind me, barely visible in the mirror's depths, stood ranks upon ranks of other figures in identical suits. All watching, all waiting. The reflection smiled, though I felt no urge to smile myself. It raised its hand in greeting, though my own arms hung at my sides, and when it spoke, its voice was the same whisper I'd heard from the scarecrow in the road. "Welcome home, Marcus." I stumbled backward, but the mirror's pull was too strong. The reflection reached through the glass impossibly horribly and grasped my wrist with fingers that felt like ice and electricity. The world tilted reality, bending like heated metal, and I was falling through silver light into darkness that had depth and weight and intention. When I woke, I was back in my car, parked on the shoulder of the highway. The sun was rising, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. My clothes were normal jeans and a t-shirt, no sign of any black suit. The glove compartment was closed, and when I opened it I found only my registration and insurance papers, exactly where they should be. But in my wallet, tucked behind my driver's license, was a business card, black with silver lettering. No name, no company, just an address and a single word. And on my wrist, barely visible unless I looked at it from just the right angle, was a mark, a perfect circle of pale skin, as if something impossibly cold had gripped me there. I've been driving for 3 days now, heading east, toward civilization, toward people and noise and electric lights that banish shadows. But every night, when the darkness falls, I see them in my peripheral vision, the watchers, the ones in black suits. They're following me, staying just out of sight, waiting for something, and sometimes, when I catch my reflection in the rear-view mirror, I see that other face looking back, the older one, the one with eyes that know things I don't want to understand. The mark on my wrist is growing darker. Story 13. The house breathes differently. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I've learned to recognize the particular whee of settling wood. The way the floorboards exhale beneath my weight as I pad barefoot across the worn hardwood. The Victorian bones of this place creak in a rhythm I've grown to expect. But lately there's been something else threading through the familiar symphony of decay. A sound like fingernails dragging across silk. Tonight marks the 7th consecutive evening I've awakened to find my sock drawer hanging open like a slack mouth. The brass handles tarnished with age and neglect. Catch what little moonlight filters through the moth-eaten curtains, casting twin crescents of pale light onto the opposite wall. My feet move of their own accord, muscle memory guiding me across the room. Even as my rational mind screams warnings, I choose to ignore. The photographs are there again, folded into grotesque parodies of carnival masks. My childhood face, distorted by creases and shadows, grins back at me with expressions I never remember making. The paper feels wrong beneath my fingertips, too smooth, too warm, as if the images still pulse with the blood of whoever handled them last. Each fold transforms my 7-year-old smile into something predatory, my wide eyes into hollow sockets that seem to track my movements across the room. I've tried burning them. God help me. I've tried. The matches strike easily enough, sulfur blooming in the stagnant air, but the flames refuse to take hold. Instead, the photographs seem to absorb the heat, growing warmer in my palm, until I'm forced to drop them. They flutter to the hardwood like wounded birds, then somehow impossibly migrate to the walls. I find them pressed against the faded wallpaper in the morning. Their edges, perfectly aligned with the roses and vines, pattern as if they'd always belonged there. The smell lingers for days afterward, lavender, but wrong, cloying and rancid like flowers left too long in standing water. It seeps into my clothes, my bed sheets, the very air I breathe, until I can taste decay on my tongue. With every inhalation I've scrubbed the walls until my knuckles bleed, replaced the air fresheners, even hired a cleaning service, but nothing dispels that sickly sweet miasma. The woman from the cleaning service, Mrs. Chen, stood in the doorway of my bedroom with her supplies clutched to her chest like armor. Her dark eyes darted from corner to corner, never quite meeting mine, and when I asked what was wrong, she simply shook her head and backed toward the stairs. "House doesn't want to be cleaned," she murmured, and I haven't seen her since. The isolation weighs heavier now that even the cleaning lady won't enter my space. I work from home, translating technical documents from Portuguese to English, a job that requires precision but little human contact. My clients communicate through email, my groceries arrive via delivery service, and my social interactions have dwindled to brief exchanges with the mailman and the occasional wrong number call. The house has become both sanctuary and prison. Its walls closing in by degrees so subtle I hardly notice until I realize I haven't left the property in 3 weeks. Sleep, when it comes, brings its own torments. I feel them before I see them, phantom fingers, ice, cold and impossibly dexterous, working at my ankles beneath the covers. The sensation is maddeningly specific, individual fingertips tracing patterns against my skin, weaving invisible threads around my bones. I've thrown back the blankets countless times, heart hammering against my ribs, only to find nothing but empty air and my own clammy flesh. But the feeling persists. Even now, as I sit in my desk chair typing these words, I can sense something coiling around my left ankle, tightening. With each keystroke, the phantom chord seems to pulse with its own rhythm, a slow hypnotic firming that matches the cadence of my heartbeat. The mirrors throughout the house have begun reflecting things that aren't there. It started small, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, easily dismissed as tricks of light or fatigue. But the distortions have grown bolder, more insistent. Yesterday, while shaving, I caught sight of a child standing behind me in the bathroom mirror. When I spun around, of course nothing was there, but the familiar clutter of toiletries and the shower curtain hanging limp and motionless. The child looked exactly like me at age 7, but wearing one of those grotesque paper masks. I find each morning the mouth hole gaped too wide, revealing glimpses of something wet and dark beyond, and the eye holes seemed to bore into me with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. I've covered every reflective surface in the house now, draping sheets over mirrors and turning picture frames face down, but I can still feel eyes watching from behind the fabric barriers, patient and unblinking. The photographs themselves have begun to multiply. What started as 3 or 4 images has expanded into dozens, then hundreds. They appear in drawers throughout the house. Not just the sock drawer now, but kitchen cabinets, bathroom vanities, even tucked between the pages of books on my shelves. Each one shows the same 7-year-old face, but folded into increasingly elaborate masks. Some sport horns curling from the temples. Others feature multiple eye holes that create the illusion of compound vision, and the most recent editions seem to incorporate additional materials, strands of hair, fragments of fingernail, things I prefer not to identify. The resemblance to my childhood self is perfect, down to the small scar on my chin from a bicycle accident and the slightly crooked front tooth that orthodontia never quite corrected. But the expressions captured in these images are nothing I remember from my actual childhood. They're knowing, calculating, predatory in a way that makes my stomach churn. I've begun to question my own memories. Did I really have such a normal childhood? The fragmented recollections swimming in my consciousness seem increasingly unreliable, like trying to grasp smoke. I remember birthday parties and summer vacations, scraped knees, and bedtime stories, but the details feel borrowed from someone else's life. When I try to focus on specific moments, they dissolve into impressions of impressions, leaving me grasping at shadows. The weaving sensation around my ankles has spread upward. Now, phantom threads coiling around my calves, my knees, my thighs. I can feel the pattern they're creating, intricate, purposeful, binding me to something I can't yet comprehend. The cold touch has become almost comforting in its consistency, the only reliable sensation in a world where everything else shifts and warps without warning. My reflection in the covered mirrors has begun to move independently. I can see it, sometimes a dark shape writhing behind the sheets. I've hung over the glass surfaces. The movement is deliberate, controlled, performing actions I'm not taking. While I stand perfectly still, my reflection gestures and beckons its shadow hands pressing against the fabric barrier. From the other side, the house itself seems to be changing walls, breathing in rhythm with my pulse, floorboards yielding beneath my feet, like flesh rather than wood. The familiar creaks and sighs have transformed into something almost conversational, as if the structure is trying to communicate in a language I don't yet understand. Food tastes different. Now, everything carries that underlying note of rancid lavender, no matter how carefully I prepare it. Water from the tap runs cloudy, filled with particles that might be dust or might be something else entirely. I've stopped eating much, surviving on crackers and bottled water delivered from outside, but even these seem contaminated by proximity to the house's influence. The boundary between waking and sleeping has begun to blur. I find myself standing in rooms with no memory of how I arrived there, engaged in activities I didn't consciously choose to perform. This morning I awakened to find myself in the basement, surrounded by hundreds of those paper masks arranged in concentric circles on the concrete floor. My fingers were stained with something dark and sticky, and my ankles burned as if invisible ropes had been pulled tight around them. The child in the mirrors has grown bolder, no longer content to hover in the background of reflections. Sometimes I catch glimpses of it moving through the house, independent of any reflective surface, a small figure in ill-fitting clothes that might have been mine decades ago. It never approaches directly, always maintaining a careful distance, but I can feel its attention like heat against my skin. The photographs have begun appearing in places I haven't looked, taped inside lampshades, tucked under cushions, even pressed between the pages of books I'm certain I've never opened. Each discovery feels like an invasion, evidence that something moves through my space while I sleep or while my attention is focused elsewhere. I've started leaving cameras running overnight, hoping to capture proof of whatever enters my bedroom, but the footage reveals nothing but static and distortion. The audio, however, captures sounds. I don't remember making footsteps, whispered conversations in a voice that might be my own, and beneath it all the soft susurrus of thread being woven through fabric. The weaving around my legs has reached my waist now, an invisible cocoon of phantom silk that seems to grow tighter with each passing hour. I can feel individual threads binding my movements, restricting my range of motion in ways both subtle and profound. Walking requires conscious effort, as if I'm moving through thick syrup, and turning my head sends ripples of tension through the invisible web. My computer screen sometimes displays images I didn't open. Childhood photographs that appear between one keystroke and the next, then vanish before I can react. The faces in these pictures wear expressions I don't recognize, emotions that seem alien and wrong. They're definitely me, but they're also something else, something that understands things my conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. The house holds its breath now, during the deepest hours of night, waiting for something I can sense but not name. The familiar sounds of settling would have stopped entirely, replaced by a silence so complete. It presses against my eardrums like physical weight. In this unnatural quiet, I can hear my own heartbeat, my own breathing, and beneath both, the whisper, soft sound of threads being drawn tight. Sleep comes in fragments. Now, if at all, I drift in and out of consciousness while sitting in chairs, standing in doorways, sometimes with my hands pressed against walls, as if trying to push my way out. During these micro-sleeps, I dream of small fingers working with infinite patience, weaving patterns that will make sense only when they're complete. The child appears more frequently during these episodes, no longer confined to mirrors or peripheral vision. It sits cross-legged on my bedroom floor, hands moving in complex gestures that leave trails of light in the air. The paper mask we wear seems to be constructed from pieces of my own face, features layered and folded until they create something that is both me and not me. When I try to approach, the phantom threads around my legs go taut, holding me in place with surprising strength. I can only watch as those small hands continue their work, weaving something vast and intricate from materials I cannot see. The boundary between the child and myself has begun to dissolve. Sometimes I look down to find my own hands moving in those same complex patterns, fingers dancing through air thick with invisible thread. The motions feel familiar, as if I've performed them countless times before, muscle memory encoded in bones and sinew. But I have no conscious recollection of learning these movements, no awareness of their purpose or significance. The house breathes with my lungs. Now its rhythm perfectly synchronized with my own. When I inhale, the walls seem to expand slightly. When I exhale, they contract in sympathy. The floorboards yield beneath my feet like a living thing, warm and responsive to my weight. I understand now that I'm not just living in this house. I'm becoming part of it, woven into its very structure by threads I can feel but cannot see. The child with my face is not an intruder but an aspect of myself, the part that knows how to work with invisible silk and phantom fiber. The photographs continue to multiply, each one a snapshot of this gradual transformation. They show the process from angles I cannot perceive, revealing details my conscious mind is not equipped to process. In the most recent images, the boundary between my flesh and the surrounding air has begun to blur, as if I'm slowly dissolving into something larger and more complex. The weaving has reached my chest now, phantom threads crisscrossing over my heart in patterns that pulse with their own internal rhythm. I can feel the design taking shape, not a trap or a cocoon, but something more sophisticated, more purposeful, a web, perhaps, or a net designed to catch things that exist in the spaces between what we call real and what we call imaginary. I no longer resist the process. When the invisible fingers work at my flesh during the deep hours of night, I lie still and let them complete their task. The cold touch has become familiar, even comforting, the only constant in a world where everything else shifts and flows like water. The pattern they're creating serves a purpose I'm beginning to understand, even if I lack the words to describe it. The child appears beside my bed now, no longer maintaining distance or hiding behind masks. Its face is my face, but clearer, somehow more focused, as if it represents everything I could have been if I'd paid attention to the right details. It watches me with eyes that hold depths I've never achieved, knowledge I've never possessed. Sometimes it reaches out with small hands that feel exactly like mine did at 7 years old and touches the threads surrounding my body. When this happens, the entire web lights up like a constellation, revealing its true scope and complexity. The pattern extends far beyond my physical form, connecting me to the house, to the photographs, to memories that might belong to me or might belong to someone else entirely. I am becoming something new, something that exists in the spaces between sleeping and waking, between memory and imagination, between the child I was and the man I believe myself to be. The threads are almost complete now, their patterns so intricate and beautiful that I can barely comprehend its scope. The house holds its breath, waiting for the final connection to be made. In the growing silence, I can hear the soft whisper of invisible silk being drawn through the fabric of reality itself, weaving me into something larger than the sum of my individual parts. Soon, I think, the work will be finished. Soon I will understand what I'm becoming, what I've always been in the process of becoming. The child with my face smiles through the darkness, its hands never stopping their patient, perfect work. The weaving continues.